Has Tim walked out again? Yes. He's so impatient. And you're to blame, Jennifer. If you were better, Tim wouldn't leave. The one speaking so freely is my father-in-law, Steve. He never says these things to Tim directly. I am always the target of his complaints. One day, after enduring it for so long, Steve collapsed. I was called into a separate room, where the doctor revealed a shocking truth. Mrs. Wilson, or rather, Jennifer, I've known you for a long time, so forgive me for being blunt, but I have to say this. Dr. Smith looked straight into my eyes, his expression serious. You need to divorce him and leave right now. When we examined Mr. Wilson, we discovered that, after hearing Dr. Smith's explanation, my face turned pale. At that moment, I made up my mind. I had to divorce Tim as soon as possible. If I stayed any longer, I would get caught up in something terrible. First, I needed to escape and secure my safety. Revenge on Tim would come later. I am Jennifer, 38 years old. I've always wanted to get married, but it just never seemed to work out. And now I've reached this age. My job as a caregiver is fulfilling, and I have my favorite musicians, so I don't have any major complaints in my personal life. In fact, I had even begun to think that staying single forever might not be so bad. However, those around me were worried, so my friend pushed me to meet someone. That someone was Tim. Tim is 5 years older than me, 43. He always had a smile on his face, exuding positivity. "Don't worry, I've got this," was his catchphrase. Though he could be a bit forceful at times, he always took care of problems promptly, just as he promised. For someone like me, who is more quiet and a bit negative, Tim became a reassuring presence. With him, I thought marriage might actually be enjoyable. For the first time in my life, I felt a clear desire to get married. However, there was one thing that concerned me. Tim had been divorced before. My first marriage was when I was young. I do have a son, but he's in college now, and we haven't talked in years. So don't worry about it. Tim tried to reassure me as I hesitated about marriage. In fact, he had already proposed to me, but he was patient while I kept my answer on hold. "Sorry, I can't decide right away." I felt bad for not being able to give an immediate answer, even though it was only natural for him to want an answer. Tim just smiled and shook his head. No, this is a lifelong decision. It's normal to be unsure. Being cautious is one of your best qualities, Jennifer. Thank you, Tim. Would I ever meet someone as kind as him again? Later, with encouragement from my friends and parents, I decided to marry him. Before our marriage, Tim lived in an apartment, so we started our married life with me moving into his place. Until then, I had never lived with anyone outside of my family. Living with a boyfriend had never even crossed my mind. I couldn't imagine what it would be like to share my life with someone else. There was always the possibility our values wouldn't align. Just because we were married didn't mean we would live in perfect harmony. I was more anxious than excited. However, contrary to my worries, life with Tim was smooth sailing. Tim worked in an office, splitting his time between remote work and going in. Because of that, on days he worked from home, he often took care of the housework more than I did. Thank you. I'm sorry you have to do this even when you're busy, Tim. I don't mind at all. It makes me happy to see you working hard, Jennifer. What a wonderful husband. Marrying him was definitely not a mistake. Just when I was basking in that happiness, an incident shook our home. We got a call that Steve had fallen and broken his leg. Since my mother-in-law had already passed away from illness, Steve lived alone. The doctor said even after it heals, he might not walk like he used to. In some cases, He might need assistance. I see. Dad is over 70 now, and living alone might be too difficult. Tim said this to me with hesitation. I'm sorry to ask this of you, Jennifer, but could we have him move in with us, living with Steve, so soon after our marriage? And if he needed care, life would become significantly harder. But if I were in Tim's position, I'd suggest the same. I couldn't imagine abandoning my own parents. All right, let's work together and make this work. Thank you, Jennifer. Looking back, I think we underestimated the situation. Just as the doctor had warned, even after his leg healed, Steve struggled to walk. He could move, but only with someone's help. Steve's lack of motivation meant he ended up spending most of his time in bed. Balancing my job and taking care of Steve turned out to be more challenging than I'd imagined. Even though I was a caregiver by profession, doing it at home was entirely different. Tim, who once seemed so composed, began to show signs of frustration every day. He would sigh dramatically when I came home from work, making sure I noticed. You've got it good, Jennifer. You get to leave the house every day, and at least it gives you a break. I'm jealous. A break? I'm just going to work. Even work is a break. I can't focus because Dad keeps calling for me even while I'm working. I'm losing my mind. Steve was proud and stubborn, refusing to wear adult diapers or even have a portable toilet in his room. This meant he needed assistance every time he had to go to the bathroom. To make matters worse, Steve had frequent urges, so the intervals were short. Tim's irritation with comments like, "We just went a little while ago," became common. This couldn't continue. From my job, I had seen many families in similar situations. If we didn't take measures, the caregiver would end up collapsing under the pressure. The first thing that came to my mind was seeking outside help. One morning, when we both had the day off, I made a suggestion to Tim. Why don't we talk to the care manager and use more support services? Right now, we only have them come once a week, but we could try short stays, too. Before I could finish, the sound of an object hitting the wall cut through the room. Tim had thrown a cushion against the wall. Though it didn't hit me, I froze in shock and fear as Tim glared at me. Don't act all high and mighty just because you're a caregiver. Do you know how it would look if we had strangers in and out of our house all the time? What would the neighbors think? They'd say, even with his son and wife around, they let someone else care for him. Think about how it looks in reality. Nobody fought that way anymore. Who wasn't seeing reality here? I wanted to argue, but fear silenced me. Tim stormed out, leaving me feeling lost. What was I supposed to do now? Having Steve move into a facility would be best, but I knew how Tim would react if I suggested it. The most logical option was for one of us to quit our job to focus on caregiving. I didn't want to quit, but I doubted Tim would. A deep sigh was the only thing I could manage. In the evening, Tim finally returned home. His face was surprisingly calm, and the first thing he did when he saw me was to apologize. "I'm sorry, Jennifer." "What?" "You were right, and I just got frustrated." Tim said this with lowered eyebrows, looking like the calm, kind man I married. "No, it's okay. Anyone would get frustrated. Let's think about what we should do next, together." "Yay, thanks." I thought it was just an outburst from being overwhelmed. But the same scenario played out again and again. I would share my thoughts. Tim would push back and storm out. Then hours later, he would come back looking composed and apologize. It became our routine. At first, I felt sorry for him, but after being caught in this cycle so many times, I began to grow weary. Tim was only calm when he felt in control, but when he felt pressured, he turned aggressive, lashing out at those around him. While he never crossed the line into physical violence, he would throw things and shout with a raised voice as if it were normal. I started to lose patience with him. Even now, I was left to take care of Steve alone, with a night shift waiting for me later. All because Tim had walked out again. "Hey, Jennifer, hurry up." "Yes, I'm coming. It's time for the bathroom." "Right." Steve's chest puffed out in that arrogant way of his. It would have been nice to get some gratitude for the K-giving, but that was just wishful thinking. "Tim's left again, hasn't he?" "Yes. He's got no patience. And you're at fault too, Jennifer. If you were better, Tim wouldn't leave." What a selfish way of thinking. Tim's frustration wasn't just on me. Steve was part of the reason, too. Rebuttals lined up in my mind, but I wasn't foolish enough to say them aloud. "I need to go prepare dinner, so I'll be going now." I left the room quickly, ignoring the fact that Steve looked like he wanted to say more. It's been 4 years since I married Tim. The first few months were great, but everything after that was hell. Tim, who would find reasons to get angry and storm out of the house. Steve, who never showed gratitude for my care and only offered unsolicited advice. Why was I still living in this house? The thought made me feel empty. I wish I could go back to my parents' home. I reached for my work bag. Inside it, I always kept a signed divorce paper. Even when I thought about divorce, my mind was a mess of emotions that held me back. If I left now, it was clear that Steve and Tim would struggle. Could I really abandon them? What if the divorce only made things worse, leading to an even more dreadful outcome? The guilt of that possibility was something I couldn't ignore. And most of all, Tim, who had been so kind when we first married. If we could find a solution for caring for Steve, maybe Tim would go back to being that person again. I couldn't let go of that hope. These were just assumptions, but they were the reasons I couldn't make up my mind about divorce. If Tim had done something decisive like violence or cheating, it would be a different story, but that wasn't the case. What should I do? As I worried and closed my eyes, my consciousness slipped away. When I came to, the room was dim. No way. Did I fall asleep? I hurriedly checked the clock, which showed 5 p.m. Realizing I wasn't late for my night shift, I felt a wave of relief. It seemed I had dozed off for about an hour. Now that I thought about it, was Steve okay with the bathroom? Just in case, I went to check on him in his room. "Steve, do you need to use the bathroom?" There was no response. Maybe he was asleep, or maybe he was ignoring me out of annoyance. "I'm heading out for my night shift soon, so I'm coming in," I announced loudly and opened the door, only to scream. "Steve." Steve was lying face down on the floor. He had a pulse and was breathing, but he was unconscious. I quickly called 911 and rode with Steve in the ambulance to the hospital. Thankfully, Steve regained consciousness at the hospital. I tried calling Tim, but he didn't answer, so I sent him a text. Just then, a nurse approached me and said, "Mrs. Wilson, the doctor would like to speak with you in another room." Oh, okay. It was probably about Steve's condition. Tim should be the one hearing this, but I couldn't reach him, so there was no choice. I hadn't been told the exact diagnosis before, but I knew Steve had a chronic illness and needed regular checkups. Tim had always made sure to accompany Steve to those checkups himself, because it's a family's job. He'd say, "Jennifer, you wouldn't be able to take responsibility if something happened, right?" When he said that with a smirk, I felt both relieved and oddly ashamed. Would this explanation now come with more talk of responsibility? But I had no choice. There was no one else here. "Excuse me." With a heavy heart, I entered the room and was surprised by who I saw. "Dr. Smith." "Jennifer, So Steve is part of your family. Dr. Smith's smile lifted my spirits, which had been so dark just moments before. Dr. Smith was a friend of my dad's and had visited my parents' house several times. He had also been my grandmother's physician, so I'd seen him almost weekly during her illness. To me, he was a kind and reliable person. Dr. Smith seemed to pause in thought before speaking. Before I explain, I need to ask a question. The man who usually comes to Steve's appointments, is he your husband? Yes. He wouldn't let me take over. He said it was just for monitoring, and there were no current medications. But he did tell me that Steve had an old chronic condition, and handed me some vitamins for Steve to take with dinner. As I spoke, Dr. Smith's expression grew darker and more serious. Dr. Smith, Mrs. Wilson, or rather, Jennifer, since I've known you for so long, I'm going to be blunt. Dr. Smith looked straight into my eyes with a serious expression. You need to get a divorce and leave immediately. When we examined Mr. Wilson, we discovered that, after listening to Dr. Smith's explanation, my face went pale. At that moment, I made up my mind. I had to divorce Tim as soon as possible. If I stayed, I would be dragged into something disastrous. About 30 minutes after arriving at the hospital, Tim burst in, out of breath. He must have been concerned about appearances, as he scanned the area before pulling me toward the car. Jennifer, where's Dad? I heard he collapsed. Yes, but the doctor said he's stable now. Before I could finish, Tim shouted, How could this happen while you were with him? Were you paying attention? Didn't you notice any signs before he fell? I didn't see anything. Tim glared at me accusingly, and I quickly averted my eyes. Hey, you just looked away, didn't you? You look away when you're hiding something. Did you find Dad to be a burden? Without him, life would be easier, wouldn't it? That's terrible. Of course not. Who knows? You've been snapping at him enough that it wouldn't be surprising if you thought that. Yes, even though Tim knew how poorly Steve treated me, he never defended or helped me. I had known this, but having it spelled out brought a wave of frustration and sadness. I glared at Tim and grabbed my work bag. I had brought it with me in a rush when getting into the ambulance. From inside, I took out the divorce papers I'd kept hidden and thrust them at Tim. If that's how you feel, then fine. I can't stay with you any longer. Tim unfolded the divorce papers, looked at them, and nodded without any change in expression. If anything, there was almost a hint of a smirk on his lips. You had this ready, huh? Well, I figured you'd bring it up eventually. Honestly, you held out longer than I thought. I knew choosing you was the right move. His attitude, as if he'd anticipated this, made me tilt my head in confusion. What do you mean, knew it? Now that the time limit's up, I might as well say it. Before we got married, Dad already needed care. Tim laughed at my stunned face. But Steve was living alone. Yeah, that's why I paid my ex-wife to take care of him. She needed the money for our son's college, and was happy to do it. But eventually, I got tired of paying for it. I thought, why not let my new wife handle it instead? So he'd had friends introduce him to me. The sheer selfishness of it was overwhelming. For the first time in my life, I shook with rage. Even if we get divorced, I'll find someone else soon enough. And Dad probably won't last much longer anyway. Yay, I'm fine with the divorce. Besides, you've let yourself go these past 4 years. I can't even look at you as a woman anymore, so it's perfect timing. Tim signed the divorce papers, using a magazine as a makeshift surface. Take care of submitting this, would you? As thanks for caring for Dad, I'll give you some money, and we'll split the assets evenly. Let's handle the details through the lawyers. Tim looked relieved, as if this was the perfect resolution. I took the divorce papers, got out of the car, and left without looking back. I went straight to submit the divorce papers. Once they were officially accepted, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. After a deep breath, I immediately called my parents. Within minutes, my father arrived, his face flushed with anger. "This is outrageous, unforgivable," Dad shouted for a while as he drove, his face red with fury, until I managed to calm him down. I understood his feelings, but we needed to avoid unnecessary trouble. Most importantly, I couldn't risk Tim turning things around and suing us. Tim needed to be the only one at fault. I packed only the essentials into the car and left the house quickly before Tim returned home. The priority was to get away completely. Taking legal action against him would come after. When we reached my parents' house, Mom came out to meet me, her eyes red from crying. "If only I'd been a better judge of character, you wouldn't have had to go through this." She seemed to feel responsible for having encouraged me to be with Tim. "It's not your fault, Mom. He's the one to blame." Thankfully, my parents' house was close enough that it wouldn't affect my job. I informed work about my divorce and carried on as usual. Living without worrying about Steve's care or Tim storming out was peaceful and soothing. After coming home and eating Mom's homemade cooking, I felt my heart and body recover even more. Just as I felt content, my phone rang, showing a familiar number. Only a month had passed since the divorce, so why was he calling? I could guess what he wanted to say. I had planned to wait a bit longer before taking the offensive, but this was the perfect opportunity. "Time to end this." "Yes." The voice on the other end hesitated before speaking in a small voice. "It's Tim." The confident tone I remembered was gone, replaced by one that seemed to gauge my reaction. "What do you need?" "Well, I was just wondering. How are you doing?" "Thanks to you, I'm doing exceptionally well." "Oh, I see. Things are rough over here." Tim let out an exaggerated sigh and began to complain about how difficult his life was now. His workplace was cutting pay due to poor performance. Work was piling up, and the house was a mess. But most of all, he was dreading Steve's return from the hospital that weekend, which meant the caregiving would start all over again. "So, is that all? Just calling to vent?" "No. It's just that, with Dad coming home, I really need an extra hand. Could you help?" "Jennifer, didn't you say you were going to find a new woman? Dad would be happier with someone familiar, and I'd pay you well." Even at this point, he was still trying to use money to sway me. His naivety made me dizzy. Normally, I would have no part in this and would refuse outright. But this time, I agreed. "I have something to discuss, so sure. Let me know the discharge date." "Really? Wow, it pays to ask. Thanks, Jennifer." Tim, basking in his excitement, had no idea. He didn't know why I was really going to the hospital. A few days later, I arrived at the hospital. Tim had asked for my help with the discharge preparations, so I headed straight for Steve's room. Tim wasn't there yet. "It's you, Jennifer," Steve sneered, frowning as soon as he saw me. "I thought you'd never show your face again. So why did you come? You stupid wife." I covered my mouth with my hand and smiled. "Oh, calling me a stupid wife. But I'm not your family anymore." "What are you talking about?" "What?" Steve's eyes widened in shock. I carefully explained to him. "Tim and I divorced over a month ago." "Did he not tell you?" "He begged me to come today, offering money in exchange for my help." "Divorced, but I didn't know." Steve's face turned pale with shock. He muttered something under his breath. "But then, what's going to happen when I come home? Tim can't manage alone. He's been so unstable lately. Who knows? Seems like he couldn't find a new wife. Must be tough not having someone to offload everything onto." "Well, that's something for you and your son to discuss." I flashed a smile just as Tim entered the room. I've packed up the things. Great. See, Jennifer, you're always a lifesaver. Tim ignored the now ashen-faced Steve and turned to me with an eager grin. Then, just as I anticipated, he said it. So how about we give us another try? Tim looked at me with a serious expression and continued without pause. I realized that you're the only one for me. Being apart made me understand how valuable you are. With you, I know we could support each other and move forward. I couldn't bring myself to look for someone new. I listened with a cold expression. Tim, engrossed in his plea. Steve, silently pleading with his eyes from the side. Thankfully, we were in a private room. I reached into my bag, pulled out a few sheets of paper, and handed them to Tim mid-sentence. Huh? He stammered as I spoke firmly. Stop with the sweet talk, will you? It's a waste of time. We're never getting back together. Running back to your ex-wife after the woman you cheated with left you. It's pathetic. Tim's eyes widened for a moment, then his face flushed red as he flared his nostrils. Who do you think you're talking to? What's with that attitude? Before you spout another cliché, look at the papers in your hands. Papers. Tim's eyes dropped to the pages, his brows knitting in confusion, but soon his lips began to tremble. His face, which had just been bright red, turned ashen. These photos of you and Meryl, the woman you planned to replace me with? I know about the 2-year affair. She confessed everything in exchange for reduced settlement. Tim was speechless. Did you really think I wouldn't find out? We were both busy, so I didn't think you'd have the time for an affair. But at a colleague's suggestion, I decided to look into it. Between caregiving and work, I hadn't had a moment to suspect anything. I trusted Tim was either home or at work, but thinking back, there were plenty of chances for him to cheat. Those times he'd throw a tantrum and storm out. He'd leave in the morning and come back in the evening, happening more frequently as time went on, first once a month, then once a week, and he'd always come back looking surprisingly calm. Of course, he did. While I took care of Steve, Tim spent his time indulging with his mistress. You told Meryl that you'd marry her once you left me, didn't you? Planning to pass the caregiving on to her, just like you did with me. But I'd reached out to Meryl first and exposed everything. Realizing she'd be stuck caring for Steve, she cut ties with Tim and disappeared. No wonder you were so confident. You had a backup wife lined up before you even left me. That wasn't my intention. I don't care what your intentions were. Just know that I'll be pursuing additional compensation. What? But I already paid you. And coming after me for more money a month after the divorce is unfair. The initial caregiving compensation I received was a pittance. I haven't received anything for the affair. And even after divorce, I can still claim compensation if I learn about it later. Unfair is using people to dispose of Steve. What? Tim's expression shifted to genuine shock. It confirmed that his actions weren't accidental but intentional. Dr. Smith had informed me of Steve's condition, medical history, and current medications. Steve had collapsed from the same condition before, and he had been prescribed medication to prevent it. It was a medication meant to prevent blood clotting. He was supposed to take it daily. However, Tim had told me to only give Steve vitamins. These vitamins, however, apparently had the effect of promoting blood clotting. In other words, for Steve, they were dangerous and could trigger his chronic condition. You said a lot to me, but in the end, it was you who found him a burden. That's why you wouldn't let me accompany him to appointments, right? So I wouldn't notice. And if something happened to Steve, you planned to blame it on me, didn't you? Even if I claimed I had unknowingly given him the wrong pills. There was no guarantee anyone would believe me. Tim could easily say, "I told her," but Jennifer insisted, making it possible for me to be held liable. "Didn't the doctor tell you before his discharge that if he took his medication regularly and attended his appointments, he could live a long life, but with no new wife lined up, having him around for years would be inconvenient? That's why you contacted me, isn't it?" Tim glanced at Steve out of the corner of his eye. Steve, stunned, stayed silent for a moment before slowly speaking up. "To think my own son would plan something like this. What kind of person are you?" "It's just that Dad was. Children should take care of their parents. How can you fail at such a basic responsibility?" "What? Don't try to act righteous now. It's your pride and stubbornness that caused all this." The two of them were on the verge of lunging at each other, shouting insults. "I've had enough. Living with you is a death sentence. Get out of that house. I'm going to a care facility. I have money, after all." A facility if Steve had the means. It was possible. Steve had been wealthy before, but that might not be the case anymore. "That's not possible. Not possible. It's better to pay professionals than rely on a son who would poison his parent." "But we don't have any money left." Tim dropped his head into his hands. He had been using up Steve's money all along. It was the reason he hadn't objected to me working during my caregiving days. He needed any bit of income. He had spent it lavishly on his affair and gambling, draining it in no time. "So there's no way I can pay Jennifer." "That won't be a problem." "What? If you sell the house and the car, it should raise enough funds. The rest can be paid in installments." Tim glared at me with resentment, but after everything he had done, it was time for him to take responsibility. After that, I entrusted everything to Dr. Smith. The hospital would involve social services and do what they could to help. Due to the deliberate nature of the medication issue, Tim was escorted to another room for questioning. They had already planned to confront him during Steve's discharge, as his actions were deemed malicious. Dr. Smith gave me a wry smile and said, "You married quite the troublemaker, didn't you?" I smiled back and said, "Well, I'm no longer married to him, so it's not a problem." In the end, Tim had to sell the house and the car. The house he had once bragged about being messy was more than just a metaphor. It had turned into an unlivable hoard. Steve used the proceeds to move into a care facility. Whether it was the shock of Tim's betrayal or the lack of anyone to engage with, Steve began showing signs of dementia. Even in the facility, Steve maintained his arrogant attitude, making it difficult for him to make friends his age and causing the staff considerable trouble. It was pitiful to think he would spend the rest of his life in loneliness, but it was his own doing. As for Tim, he was living in a cheap apartment due to his financial struggles. He kept his job, but felt deeply embarrassed as news of his actions had spread among his colleagues. Though he wanted to quit, he knew finding a new job at his age would be difficult, so he continued working and went straight home after work. We had been talking in a private hospital room, but it was just that, a simple private room. There was no soundproofing, so everything we said could be heard outside. One of Tim's coworkers happened to pass by and hear the conversation, and the rumors spread quickly. Thankfully, this meant there would likely be no new victims. Incidentally, I received a sincere apology and settlement from Meryl, the woman Tim had an affair with. She claimed she hadn't known Tim was married until after they began their relationship. Even after learning the truth, she couldn't bring herself to end it and continued the affair. She, like me, had been used by Tim. While I felt some sympathy, I made sure to collect the full settlement, minus a portion for her information. I returned to my parents' home and now enjoy peaceful days. Perhaps due to their guilt for encouraging my marriage to Tim, my parents no longer mentioned anything about remarriage. As for me, I'd be open to remarrying if the right person came along. The only change since the divorce has been that some of the clients at work have tried to set me up with their grandsons. But that's a type of encounter I'd rather avoid. I'm not fixated on marriage, but I do want to become someone my parents can be proud of, so they won't have to worry anymore. Though my marriage was a disaster, one good thing came out of the ordeal. Dr. Smith was there for me. Recently, I heard he even reached out to Dad to check on how I was doing. It seems he'll be visiting my parents' home soon, and I'm looking forward to seeing him again.
My father-in-law's turn came, and he went into the examination room with the nurse after his name was called. However, when I tried to accompany him, the nurse stopped me. Puzzled, I was guided in the opposite direction of the examination room and called into a separate room. In the room, there was a slender doctor, and his almond-shaped eyes stared intently at me. Then, as if he had made up his mind, he opened his mouth. "How much do you know?" "Huh?" I was stunned, not knowing what he was talking about. "Oh, I'm sorry. I mean, well." His halting response made me grow more suspicious. What was he trying to say? "Geez, you're as bad at talking as ever." At that voice, I turned around and there stood my husband David, who was supposed to be away on a business trip, with his arms crossed. Why was David here? Ignoring my confusion, David said, "I want you to look at this." As he spoke, David operated his smartphone and showed it to me.
"What? No way! Why?"
My eyes widened as I stared intently at the screen. My pottery creations were being sold on an unfamiliar website. Surprise and agitation swirled together, and my head was in a mess. Of course, I had no idea about this. Who would do such a thing, and why? I felt more sadness than anger. "I need to check something with Tom." "About Dad." Those words made me flinch. What did he intend to confirm about Nick? I waited intently for David's next words. "My name is Mary. I live with my husband David and Nick." "Nick, the weather is nice today. The azaleas in the garden are starting to bloom."
"Is that so? Is it that time of year already?"
Nick, who was laughing beside me, is actually completely blind. I knew that Nick's eyesight hadn't been very good for a while. He said that the edges of his vision had turned black and the range he could see had gradually narrowed. The cause was unknown, and treatment didn't progress, but he was able to live with the help of his wife. But after losing his wife, his condition suddenly worsened. Neither David nor I ever thought he would lose his sight so quickly. David said he couldn't leave Nick alone, living by himself without being able to see. That's true. It's dangerous to be alone. There have been a lot of scams lately, too. David and I talked it over and decided to live with Nick. Nick can't work, so he now lives on disability benefits. This was something his late wife had arranged for him, and it was steadily deposited into his account every month. He had apparently been withdrawing small amounts as needed, but a considerable amount remained. With this much, we could have asked a home helper, but Nick wouldn't agree to it. He insisted that it would be a waste of money and to forget about it. I quit my job to take care of Nick. My boss said, "It's a shame to lose someone as talented as you, Mary." But it couldn't be helped. I decided to work a part-time job a few days a week and take on all of Nick's care and household chores. "Mary, I'm so sorry you had to quit your job. I was expecting it, so don't worry about it. How's everything going for you?" "Actually, the company decided to expand overseas, so I might have more business trips from now on." David works for a manufacturer, but I had never heard of him going abroad before.
That's great.
I was thrilled, but David looked somewhat gloomy. But I'll be lonely not being with you, Mary. He let out a small sigh and headed for the shower room. It was the first time I had seen David so downcast. He's always smiling and rarely says he's lonely. So David's words were unexpected, and I was surprised. Did my show of joy backfire? As David had said, starting the following month, he began going on more business trips and naturally spent more days away from home. I was busy every day preparing Nick's meals, cleaning the house, and going to my part-time job. But as I was shopping at the supermarket, a thought suddenly occurred to me. Taking care of Nick was easier than I had expected. When we first started living together, I thought I would have to help a lot with things like showers, going to the bathroom, and moving around the house and when we went out. I thought I would have to feed him because he probably wouldn't be able to hold a fork or anything to eat. Surprisingly, he can actually take showers and go to the bathroom all by himself. He even eats his meals quite neatly on his own. Inside the house, he walks smoothly without stumbling over boxes or anything.
It's not a problem because I'm used to the house,
Nick says with a laugh. Even more astonishingly, Nick can operate a smartphone for simple tasks. He makes phone calls and looks things up by skillfully using the voice recognition feature. Sometimes when I hear voices coming from Nick's room, it turns out he's chatting with the AI on his smartphone. Even I only use my smartphone for calls and messages. That being said, checkups are still necessary, so Nick goes to the hospital regularly. But whenever I offer to go with him, for some reason he insists on going alone.
But there are crosswalks and it's dangerous.
It's fine, there are sound signals.
But you have to get on and off the bus too. I can do it by myself.
Nick snaps, getting a bit angry, and leaves on his own. I secretly follow him, worried, but he really does cross the streets alone and has no problem riding the bus. Later, he tells me he walks using the voice navigation on his smartphone. Nick is stubbornly determined to do everything himself, as if he's trying to distance himself from me. But I suppose it's a good thing that I'm able to avoid the situation of being totally overwhelmed by caregiving and housework. Having some peace of mind and free time, I was able to go to a pottery workshop nearby. It was just a one-day experience, but I unexpectedly enjoyed it and got hooked right away. Since then, I've started teaching myself a little at home. I bought a pottery magazine, and while reading it, a headline caught my eye. It said that small pieces can be fired in a home oven. As I read on, it seems there really is clay like that. Most of the tools can be found at the dollar store, so you can easily do pottery at home, the article said. I decided to secretly give it a try at night whenever I could find some spare time. My grades in art class were never good in elementary and middle school. Me, starting pottery. It has me in high spirits every day, and I even hum to myself. One night, when David came to the kitchen for some water, he saw me kneading clay while humming. "What are you making? A giant cookie?" David pointed to the flattened light brown clay on the baking sheet. I was rolling it out to make a plate. "Ah. I thought it was a late-night snack," he said. "Too bad. But take a look again once it's finished." Saying goodnight, David went back to his room. David is going on another business trip starting tomorrow. He seemed to want to talk with me a bit more, but he quickly left, probably trying to be considerate. It's a strange feeling, like we're somehow out of sync, but not on bad terms. As if to shake off that feeling, I focused on my pottery. At first I was making simple shapes like plates. But as I gradually got used to it, that wasn't enough anymore. Though I can't make full-fledged pottery pieces either. While I was experimenting with what to make, a gust of wind blew the papers and envelopes off the desk. I had forgotten that I opened the window in the afternoon. I hurriedly gathered them up and used a nearby bottle as a paperweight.
That's it. A paperweight would be small enough for me to make.
It's not like I'm presenting it anywhere, so I decided to make one on a whim.
I want something a little stylish.
I pondered while kneading the clay, and the image of a cat I used to have came to mind. It was a stray that we took in and named Belle. I lovingly raised it together with David. I'll use Belle as my model. Once I decided, things moved quickly from there. What did her face look like, her paws, her legs, her tail? I slowly started to remember. In a photo on my smartphone, Belle is being held by David, looking not entirely thrilled about it. It reminded me of how the two of us and Belle happily spent time together back then. Belle is on the other side of the Rainbow Bridge now, but I wonder if she's doing well. After lots of trial and error, I finished making the Belle paperweight in about a month. I was so thrilled that I wanted to show it to someone. It just so happened I was going to lunch with my friends, so I decided to bring it and show them. My friends turned their smartphone cameras toward it, saying how cute it was. I was surprised by the unexpectedly positive reaction. Next to the pasta plate at lunch, Belle's not entirely thrilled expression had a certain charm. My friends even requested that I make one for them too. Really? But it's just an amateur handmade piece. The fact that it's handmade is apparently a plus. The following month, I brought a few more Belle paperweights in different poses. My friends each took their favorite one, and I was left with the one of Belle washing her face. A week later, I realized that I had received several messages from a friend I had given Belle's paperweight to. According to her, when she posted the paperweight on social media, she received dozens of messages within just 3 days. Most of them were asking where they could buy one for themselves. I was astonished that it had generated such a response. My friends unanimously urged me to start selling them online. They said they would definitely sell. But I hadn't made them to make money. It was just a hobby of sorts, and I was very reluctant to turn it into a business. Above all, I'm not very savvy with the internet and have no idea what to do or how to do it. I only check messages from friends every 2 to 3 days and hardly use my smartphone. As I agonized over what to do, the number of inquiries kept growing, surpassing 100. My friends must have felt bad, as they started trying to properly pay me for them. I'm the one who feels bad. I've been having them reply to messages from friends on social media, saying they're not for sale. The same topic came up again when we were having lunch. Well, maybe I should at least take enough to cover the cost of materials. After all, I'm not a professional potter by trade. When I said that would be plenty, they were happy to pay it. David was also interested in this little figurine. When he came back from a business trip and found Belle's paperweight on his desk, he exclaimed,
Hey! Isn't this Belle? Did you make this yourself?
He picked it up between his thumb and index finger and brought it over to me with a delighted look.
Yep. Spinning image, isn't it? It's amazing. This Belle is so darn cute. It's really well made.
When I told him it had become a topic of conversation on social media, David was thrilled. Selling online is easy. You just make a site, post some photos, and...
Don't make it sound so simple.
I'll help you out. I may not look like it, but I'm a salesman, you know. Leave it to me, David said, getting enthusiastic and starting to make plans about online stores and whatnot. But selling means running a business, even if it's small. I don't have the confidence to start something like that on a whim.
I'm not interested in selling them.
I took Belle's paperweight from David's hand and put it back on the desk.
Besides, I don't really know much about the internet.
I'll support you, so...
Oh, that reminds me, I finished the plate I was making the other day. Let me go get it.
I open the kitchen cupboard. I can't see what kind of expression David has on his face. When I came back from the kitchen, David was gone. On the desk, only Belle's paperweight remained, washing its face. Belle. What should I do? Belle doesn't answer. It just kept washing its face as if to say it doesn't know. One day, I came home humming, and Nick called out to me. Did something good happen? That day, I had gone to show Belle's paperweight to my pottery class teacher. I had vaguely mentioned to Nick that I was taking pottery classes, but we hadn't really talked about it much before.
I went to show my teacher something I made in that pottery class I mentioned before.
Nick, sitting in the living room chair, listened to my story. What kind of plate was it?
This time it wasn't a plate, it was a figurine.
As I said that, I felt something was off. What did Nick just say? Smiling beside me as I wondered, Nick opened his mouth again. That's great. I wonder if I could do pottery too.
What?
I couldn't believe my ears, but I thought this was an opportunity. This could be a chance to get closer to Nick, who tries to keep his distance. That way, I could stop him from doing dangerous things like crossing the street by himself.
I'm sure you could. You seem like you'd be good with your hands, Nick.
There are people who paint even though they can't see. I let Nick feel sample plates and taught him how to shape the clay into similar forms. Because he can't see, he kneads the clay while checking the shape over and over with his fingertips. He seems to enjoy the fresh sensation of the clay's texture, coolness, and softness. Nick seemed to keep making things while I was out at my part-time job. When I get home, several pieces are lined up on the cooking sheet. The ceramic pieces were all adorable, even if their shapes were a bit unusual.
Wow, you're really good at this.
I carefully carried them to the drying shelf, trying not to break them. I kept an eye on how they were drying and fired each one in the oven. As I was doing this, I noticed another odd thing.
Oh, the Belle figurine I left here is gone.
The figurine of Belle washing his face, which should have been on the desk, had disappeared. I also realized that the rabbit and frog figurines I had put out were missing. When I asked Nick, he said that he might have accidentally broken or thrown them away. I was always carrying them around for reference. I'm sorry.
Is that so?
I'm really sorry. Because of my blindness, even the cat figurine. I couldn't pursue the matter any further.
It's okay. Maybe. I know, some elves took them.
I said with a laugh, trying to brush it off. Even with such childish words, Nick seemed reassured. Nick continued his work after that, but I started to feel a clear sense of unease about his words and actions. When I told David about it, he made a surprised face.
I'm always away for work or on business trips,
he said vaguely, as if he didn't know. Amidst these unsettling days, the time came for Nick's regular checkup. David had left for a business trip in the morning. Nick and I had gotten a little closer through pottery, so today I was going with him. We arrived at the hospital before noon, completed the reception, and waited for our turn in the waiting room. The women at the reception desk seemed to be looking at us and talking about something. No, they might not necessarily be talking about me or Nick. Thinking I was being self-conscious, I opened the pottery magazine I had brought. Eventually, our turn came and Nick's name was called. He went into the examination room with a nurse. However, when I tried to accompany him, the nurse stopped me. I wondered why. It was my first time coming with Nick, so perhaps they were verifying who I was. As I pondered this, I alone was guided in the opposite direction of the examination room and shown to a separate room. Inside, there was a thin doctor sitting in a chair, handing a file folder to a nurse. After the nurse left the room, the doctor looked at me. His name tag read Tom. His narrow eyes stared intently at me, and he opened his mouth without me being able to read his intentions. "How much do you know?"
Huh?
What was he talking about? I stared at Tom, dumbfounded and confused. I thought he meant Nick's eyesight, but something seemed off.
This is my first time accompanying him for a checkup, so I'm not sure what I'm being asked.
I'm sorry. I didn't explain properly. I mean, well. His hesitant response made me grow more suspicious.
What on earth is going on? Well, you see.
As if startled, he stared past me. I turned around to see David, who was supposed to be on a business trip, standing there with his arms crossed.
Geez, you're as bad at talking as ever.
I couldn't hide my surprise at David's exasperated sigh. David, why are you here?
I needed to check something with Tom. About Dad.
Him mentioning his father made me stop short. What did Tom need to verify about Nick? From David's attitude towards Tom, I could tell they were quite close. Apparently they had been friends since their student days.
I also have something I want to confirm. Mary, can you tell me more about Nick's usual behavior?
When asked about his usual behavior, I described his routine from waking up to going to bed. He can shower, use the bathroom, and eat properly all by himself. He can go to his regular checkups and come back on his own, and at home, he enjoys chatting on his smartphone. As I described Nick's ordinary daily life, Tom nodded in understanding. I also mentioned that Nick had recently started pottery and was immersed in it during the day while I was out. I showed them photos of Nick's pottery that I had taken with my smartphone. His recent works had become more well-shaped, with no distortions. Seeing this, Tom let out a small groan.
Anything else? Especially in Nick's words or actions that seemed odd to you?
Asked this, I pondered for a while. The only thing that came to mind was how he tried to do everything himself despite supposedly being completely blind. It seemed like he was trying to distance himself from me somehow.
I see. Anything else that bothered you? Now that you mention it.
I remembered. Just a few days ago, some of my pottery pieces had gone missing from the house. When I asked Nick, he said he might have accidentally thrown them away because he couldn't see. But something about that didn't sit right with me. Going back a little further, I recalled the odd feeling I had just before Nick said he wanted to do pottery.
I told him I went to show my work to my pottery teacher. But
at that time, Nick had asked what kind of plates they were. As if he had seen me making plates before and knew about it. Then David started to speak. I want you to see this too. As he said this, David showed me his smartphone. On it was a photo of the missing Belle figurine washing its face. Looking closely, there was a price attached, and it seemed to be listed on some sales website.
What? No way. Why?
I stared at the screen in shock. I had no recollection of listing it, so why was it here? Surprise and confusion swirled together, making my head spin. More than anger, I felt a deep sadness welling up inside me. So Mary, you really didn't know about this website or that the work was being sold online? David looked at me seriously, and I nodded.
I have no idea about this either. Who on earth would do such a thing?
We'll find out soon. Muttering cryptically, David made a call to somewhere. Tom also watched David, nodding. Not understanding what was going on, I just stared at the two of them. Hello? Is this the police? I was dumbfounded seeing David calling the police. The story goes back 2 days. While on break with a colleague from work, David was introduced to a website specializing in selling cat figurines. He was told there was a figurine they were interested in and asked to take a look. They showed it to me because the design of a cat washing its face is rare. The moment David saw it, he had a gut feeling it was the Belle figurine I had made. When he was shown the seller's information, it said the works were being sold to raise funds for stray cat rescue activities. It also stated that the artist was completely blind, giving David a bad feeling. The artist's name is Nick and he's totally blind. And the familiar-looking figurine. David said there was only one person he could think of who could get their hands on this. It's hard to imagine Mary cooperating. She said she wasn't interested in selling. David seemed to recall the odd feeling I had mentioned too. If I hadn't heard your story, I wouldn't have realized. Dad might not actually be blind. Tom continued David's hesitant words. Just 2 days ago, David contacted me about Nick. He was quite surprised when I said I was in charge of his case. In fact, Tom had doubts about Nick's vision. During examinations, Nick acts as though he can't see. But on the other hand, Tom felt his gait and movements didn't seem like those of a visually impaired person. The nurses had the same impression. I don't want to doubt a patient, but... Tom said this, looking downcast. Just then, there was a sudden commotion coming from the hallway. As we hurried out of the room in a panic, we saw Nick being questioned by 2 police officers who had rushed over. Nick seemed to be shouting something and was in a state of panic. Nick! I tried to run over to him, but David grabbed my arm and stopped me. Immediately after, Nick shook off the officer's hand and ran away at full speed. The waiting room was full of patients, and bumping into them would not end well. But Nick nimbly avoided the waiting room chairs, patients, and nurses. It was as swift as a soccer player slipping past an opponent in front of the goal. As everyone stood dumbfounded, the 2 police officers quickly chased after Nick and caught him in no time.
Let me go! I'm blind!
His cries rang out in vain, making it evident that Nick could indeed see. The 2 officers stood Nick up and took him away for questioning. Later investigation revealed that Nick had created and operated a fraudulent sales website. On the site, he was selling his own works as well as some of mine. His motive seemed to be money, and the story about raising funds for stray cat rescue was a lie. He confessed that he did it because he couldn't live on his pension alone. After the commotion at the hospital, local media came every day requesting interviews. The story of Nick pretending to be completely blind, even deceiving his family, and selling handmade cat figurines had become a bit of a news item. I'm sorry. I cannot comment on that. I repeated this answer through the doorbell every day. As for Nick, he was given the cold shoulder by the entire neighborhood and wouldn't come out of his bedroom. At a loss, we decided to ask Nick's older brother Ben for help. Ben had previously been in the military and was apparently a strict instructor. He had a very kind personality but also a strong sense of justice, so he was furious about Nick's actions this time. Even though Ben lived in a town about a 3-hour flight away, he arrived with an enraged expression.
How pathetic. I'm going to bring him to my house for some strict guidance for a while.
He entered the bedroom and grabbed the trembling Nick by the neck.
Ben, stop! I don't want to go outside.
Nick clung to him, half crying, but was powerless against Ben. Ben simply said, I apologize for the trouble he caused, and left with Nick. Nick had always been intimidated by Ben.
He won't be able to do any more bad things now. This will make Dad live an honest life too.
David muttered sadly, as if to say this was for the best. David immediately shut down the site Nick had created, but something unexpected was happening online. Today, a colleague told me. Apparently, photos of the site that was supposed to be closed were being spread on social media by others who had seen it. The cats I made were said to have kinder expressions compared to the cat figurines Nick made, and this was becoming a topic of discussion. It seemed the creator's personality came through, and as it gained popularity, the reputation spread further.
My colleague said he wants one of Belle's paperweights too.
David spoke with a hint of excitement, looking very happy.
But the site is closed, and I'm not really keen on online sales.
About that, David started speaking energetically. An acquaintance of David's colleague apparently runs a gift shop in this neighborhood. The female shop owner also saw my works on social media and definitely wanted to carry them in her store. But she was having trouble because she couldn't find my contact information. In this neighborhood.
You mean that stylish shop on the corner?
That's the one.
Why don't you go check it out tomorrow?
At David's suggestion, I decided to visit the shop right away. The shop owner wore lots of cat accessories, making it clear she was quite a cat lover. I agreed to her offer and decided to have my works displayed in the shop. A few days later, I brought over plates in addition to the paperweights to display. A slight feeling of happiness mixed with anxiety about whether they would actually sell. Often, the pieces would sell out while I was in the process of making more. The sales were just pocket money, but I was still filled with surprise and joy. I decided to donate a portion of it to stray cat rescue activities. I thought that would make Belle happy too. This donation activity led to increased interactions with fellow stray cat rescuers and local artists. My pottery class teacher seems to drop by occasionally too. Every day is fulfilling, and I'm living a very enjoyable life. I'm now called Belle by them. It's embarrassing to be called by my beloved cat's name, but this must be a bond Belle has created for me.
Isn't that right, Belle?
I gazed at the paperweight of Belle washing her face on the living room table.
I'm home.
David, who had returned home without me noticing, approached with a big smile. I wonder what happened.
Today is our wedding anniversary and the day we first met Belle.
As he spoke, David placed the cake box he was holding next to Belle. Ah, that's right. My heart filled with happiness, and I spontaneously hugged David. Belle smiled as she washed her face.
It's nothing. I'm fine, Mom. Don't worry about it.
Crystal told me, her face flushed a deep crimson. Crystal is in first grade and attends an after-school program when classes end for the day. On days when the program isn't running, we usually drop her off at her grandparents' house. But lately, something seems off with Crystal. Every time I go to pick her up, her face is bright red for some reason. When I ask her grandmother Barbara about it, she just says,
"Oh, she was probably engrossed in a video game."
And all Crystal will tell me is,
"It's nothing."
Concerns weighing on my mind, I brought the matter up with my husband Fred. But even when he casually tried to get answers from Barbara and Crystal, he got the same responses I did. Fred and I were worried about Crystal's well-being, but she always seemed so happy and carefree once she was back home. So we decided to just keep an eye on the situation for a while. Then the unthinkable happened.
What? Crystal collapsed?
I was at work, going about my day as usual, when I got a call from the elementary school. Crystal had collapsed and was being rushed to the hospital. I hurried to the hospital, meeting up with Fred, who had also rushed over. Together, we listened to what the doctor had to say. Thankfully, Crystal's condition wasn't life-threatening. Once she recovered, she would be able to come home. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. The doctor's next words drained the color from both my and my husband's faces. Apparently, while being transported to the hospital, Crystal had been muttering something over and over in a delirious state. As soon as I finished hearing what the doctor had to say, I immediately called the person who came to mind and demanded answers.
Crystal collapsed today and had to be rushed to the hospital. Can we talk about what happened?
My name is Amy. I'm a 34-year-old accountant at a cosmetics company. I love my job, and my colleagues often refer to me as a career woman. Fred works in sales at the same company. We first met 10 years ago. We were introduced at a camping trip organized by a mutual friend from work. Being the same age, we hit it off right away. By the end of the day, we had exchanged numbers and started hanging out regularly, just the two of us. I was drawn to Fred's kind nature and how thoughtful he was. Eventually, I decided to take the initiative and ask him out. As it turned out, Fred had feelings for me too. He gladly accepted.
I was planning on asking you out myself, but sorry for making you confess first, Amy. But I'm really happy. Here's to our future together.
Seeing Fred grin sheepishly as he said that melted my heart. And so, we started dating. Before long, we had moved in together. Our relationship grew steadily, and after about a year of dating, we decided to get married. We agreed it was time to announce our engagement to our respective parents, starting with a family meeting at Fred's family home. Fred's parents' house is about a 30-minute drive from where we live. Fred's father had passed away from an illness about 5 years ago, so currently, Barbara lives there alone. On the day we went to visit, I was incredibly nervous. Fred smiled and said,
"There's no need to be so anxious,"
helping to ease my tension. When we arrived at Fred's family home, Barbara welcomed me with a warm smile.
"Well, hello there. I'm so glad you could make it. And Fred, it's been a while."
It's a pleasure to meet you. I'm Amy. I hope you'll like this. As I spoke, I handed her the expensive gift I had purchased from the department store the other day. Barbara was delighted.
"Oh my, how thoughtful of you. Thank you. I'll brew some tea, so you two just make yourselves at home."
Barbara interacted with me in a comfortably distanced manner, and time passed peacefully. Regarding our marriage, Barbara smiled and said,
"Congratulations, truly. I'm so happy that Fred is marrying a wonderful woman like you, Amy. I'm sure his father in heaven is thrilled too."
I felt a profound sense of relief, grateful that Barbara was such a kind person. As noon approached, Barbara glanced at the clock and announced,
"It's almost lunchtime. I'll whip something up, so you two be sure to eat before you go."
I appreciated Barbara's offer, but I felt bad about making her go through the trouble and hesitated, unsure of how to respond. That's when Fred chimed in.
"Since it's a special occasion, why don't we all go out to eat? Didn't you mention a new restaurant that opened up nearby, Mom? Let's check it out."
Ah, that's a good point. That restaurant is always packed with people, so the food must be delicious. It's settled then, let's head over right away. And so, the three of us went to the restaurant and enjoyed a pleasant lunch together. With that, the marriage announcement went smoothly. The following week, Fred and I visited my parents to share the news of our engagement. They were overjoyed. My parents seemed to take a strong liking to Fred, impressed by his polite demeanor. A few months later, we held our wedding ceremony. We invited many of our colleagues from work, and everyone celebrated with us grandly. One day, as we were enjoying our tranquil married life, we received a call from Barbara. She had taken a fall at home and injured her arm. Oh, what a pickle I'm in. I can move my arm, but I can't lift anything heavy. Doing household chores is such a struggle. Goodness, I never imagined I'd end up with an injury like this. Barbara said over the phone, her voice feeble.
"That's terrible. On my days off from work or whenever I can, I'll come over as much as possible."
I assured her. Barbara hesitated for a moment, then made a suggestion that seemed difficult for her to say. "Thank you, dear. But even though it's just a 30-minute drive, it would be a hassle for you to come so frequently, Amy. If possible, I'd be thrilled if you could move closer to my place. It would be great if you were within walking distance. Just having you two nearby would put my mind at ease. What do you think?" Living alone, Barbara must have felt vulnerable after injuring her arm.
I see, I understand. I'll discuss it with Fred and get back to you, I said.
I immediately brought up the matter with Fred. Mom has probably been feeling lonely ever since Dad passed away. And with her arm injury, it's concerning. Maybe we should move closer to her. Are you okay with that, Amy? If you're not comfortable with the idea, please tell me honestly. It would make our commute to work a bit longer since the company would be farther away.
Whenever Fred makes a decision, he always makes sure to consider my thoughts and feelings, rather than deciding on his own. Of course I don't mind. I'm worried about Barbara too, so let's find a place as close to her house as possible. That way, we can rush over quickly if needed. The longer commute time is still within a manageable range, so it's fine, I said with a smile. And so, we rented a condominium just a 5-minute walk from Barbara's place. Barbara was overjoyed, and as time passed, her arm injury gradually healed. Some time later, I discovered that I was pregnant. Fred, I think we're having a baby, I told him. Wait, really? Fred's eyes widened in surprise and delight. Barbara was also eagerly anticipating the arrival of her first grandchild, and we all looked forward to the day we could meet the baby. 3 days past my due date, I gave birth to a healthy baby girl. After discussing it with Fred, we decided to name her Crystal. I worked up until shortly before giving birth, and then took childcare leave. Raising a child for the first time was challenging at times, but Fred was always actively involved in both housework and childcare, which I was immensely grateful for. Crystal grew up healthy and strong, showered with love and affection. I had always loved children, but I savored the blissful realization that my own child was unbelievably precious. When Crystal turned 2, we enrolled her in daycare, and I returned to work. Time flew by, and before we knew it, Crystal was in 1st grade. She had grown into an honest and kind-hearted child. After starting elementary school, we had her attend an after-school program. On days when the program was closed, Barbara would look after her. One such day, I dropped Crystal off at Barbara's as usual and went to work. After finishing for the day, I went to pick Crystal up from Barbara's house. To my surprise, Crystal's face seemed unusually flushed, which concerned me. I asked Barbara about it. Barbara, Crystal's face looks a bit red. Did something happen? Could she have a fever? Barbara replied, Oh, she was just playing an active video game until a little while ago. That's all it is, nothing to worry about. She doesn't have a fever or anything.
A video game? I didn't know you had video games at your place, Barbara, I said, puzzled.
An acquaintance gave it to me. She got a bit too engrossed in it, that's probably why. The temperature is a little high today too.
I nodded at Barbara's answer, but decided to check with Crystal just in case. Crystal, you're not feeling sick or anything, right? No, it's nothing, Crystal replied, giving me an awkward nod. Are you sure you're okay? I asked again. This time, Crystal answered in a clearer tone than before.
I'm fine. Don't worry about it, Mom. I'm fine. Don't worry about it, Mom.
However, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off with Crystal, so I decided to discuss it with Fred. After Crystal went to bed, I brought it up with Fred right away. You know, when I went to pick Crystal up from Barbara's house today, her face seemed unusually red. It looked like she was flushed. When I asked about the reason, Barbara said it was because she got too absorbed in a video game she received from an acquaintance. Crystal also said she was fine, but something about her behavior seemed strange to me. I wonder if it's really because of the game.
Oh, that happened? But Crystal seemed her usual self at home,
Fred said, surprised, as he tried to recall Crystal's behavior after returning home. Exactly. By the time she got home,
The redness in her face had faded and she was happily going about her business. So I don't think there's anything to worry about, but something just doesn't sit right with me. I can't quite put my finger on it. Maybe I'm overthinking it.
I understand. I'll try asking Mom and Crystal about it casually too. Thanks for telling me.
Later, Fred inquired with Barbara and Crystal, but Barbara maintained that it was due to the video game, and Crystal simply said it was nothing.
Crystal just keeps saying it's nothing. Fred reported back.
I see.
Then maybe I am worrying too much. Let's just keep an eye on the situation for a while.
However, even after that, every time we left Crystal with Barbara, her face would be red. Growing genuinely concerned, I asked Crystal repeatedly what was wrong, but she would always respond with,
It's nothing. I'm fine.
Once she got home, Crystal would draw pictures and spend time cheerfully, so it didn't seem like she was feeling unwell. That only made it all the more puzzling why her face would turn red whenever she went to Barbara's house.
This never used to happen before.
I muttered to myself as I started preparing dinner. Ever since she was little, Crystal had enjoyed helping me with cooking. So sometimes, I would ask Crystal to assist with simple, safe tasks like peeling eggshells or using a peeler to remove carrot skins. Tonight, I was making meatloaf, so I decided to have Crystal help with the kneading process. I chopped and sautéed the onions, then placed them in a large bowl along with the ground meat, breadcrumbs, eggs, and seasonings. With everything ready, I called out to Crystal, who was drawing.
Crystal, want to help me knead the meatloaf together? Yeah, I'll do it.
Crystal said with a smile, using her small hands to knead the meatloaf mixture.
You're doing great. The stickiness is really coming together, so just a little more. With Crystal kneading it, I'm sure this meatloaf will turn out delicious. Let me know if you get tired, and I'll take over.
When I praised her, Crystal grinned happily. Then, after a short while, I noticed Crystal staring intently at the kitchen knife.
Why are you staring at the knife like that? Oh, could it be that you're interested in cutting too, Crystal? Should I buy you a kid's knife that's not too dangerous? Speaking of which, the other day at the department store, they were selling these cute children's knives with cat illustrations on them. Do you want to try using one, Crystal?
When I asked her that, Crystal shook her head. Then, in a small voice, she said,
I don't need one,
and focused on kneading the meatloaf mixture. I thought I noticed Crystal's expression darken for a moment, but she quickly returned to her usual cheerful self, so I figured I must have imagined it. Just as the meatloaf was finished, Fred came home from work, and the three of us gathered around the dining table, enjoying a pleasant meal together as always.
Crystal helped me knead the meatloaf. I told Fred. Oh, really?
Fred said, looking impressed.
That's great. Crystal, you're such a good girl for helping Mom out. The meatloaf is delicious.
Praised by Fred, Crystal smiled shyly. During this blissful family time, I had completely forgotten about the strange incidents with Crystal. However, soon after, the worst possible event occurred. The next day, while I was at work, I received a call from Crystal's elementary school.
Is this Crystal's mom? Crystal collapsed during her cooking class and has been rushed to the hospital. Please head to the hospital she was transported to immediately.
Upon hearing this from the teacher, I felt the blood drain from my face.
What? Is Crystal going to be all right?
We don't have the details of her condition either. At the very least, she was barely conscious when the ambulance arrived, but
I understand. I'll head to the hospital right away.
I quickly explained the situation to my boss, hopped into a taxi, and made my way to the hospital. In the taxi, I was beside myself with worry for Crystal.
Please, let her be okay.
I prayed repeatedly in my heart for Crystal's safety. Soon after, Fred arrived at the hospital as well, and together we listened to the doctor explain Crystal's condition. Fortunately, her life was not in danger. She had collapsed due to anemia. Crystal was currently sleeping and had not yet woken up, but the doctor said she would regain consciousness soon. If her condition stabilized, it would be possible for her to return home today. Fred and I were relieved to hear that Crystal's life was not at risk, even though we were still worried about her. However, what the doctor said next left us in utter shock.
While being transported, Crystal was apparently muttering something. She kept saying, "I'm sorry, Grandma. Mom, please don't hate me." What?
During the ambulance ride, while Crystal was in a semi-conscious state, she had repeatedly murmured, as if talking in her sleep, "I'm sorry, Grandma. Mom, please don't hate me." My face turned ashen, and my body began to tremble. No matter how I looked at it, there was something going on between Barbara and Crystal. Why was Crystal apologizing to Barbara? Why did she think I would hate her? I glanced at Fred and saw that he was also perplexed and had turned pale. After the doctor left, I told Fred,
"Crystal must have had some kind of altercation with Barbara, don't you think?"
At my words, Fred nodded in agreement.
Yeah, I think so too. If Crystal said something like that, there's no doubt something happened.
"You're right. I'm going to call Barbara."
Fred and I stepped outside the hospital to avoid disturbing others and made the call.
Hello.
Barbara answered promptly. "Hello, Barbara. It's Amy."
Oh, Amy. What's the matter, calling at this hour? Aren't you at work?
As Barbara wondered aloud, I immediately posed my question.
"Crystal collapsed. Do you have any idea why?"
What? Crystal collapsed? What happened?
Barbara sounded extremely surprised, her voice unnaturally high-pitched. However, upon hearing what I said next, Barbara's attitude completely changed.
"Crystal collapsed during her cooking class at school. Apparently, while being transported to the hospital, she was muttering, 'I'm sorry, Grandma. Mom, please don't hate me.' People don't normally say things like that, right? Barbara, did you do something to Crystal?"
Humph. What a weakling.
Barbara spat out. I was shocked to hear Barbara speak in a tone I'd never heard before.
What? Barbara, what did you just say? I said she's a weakling. I was only trying to teach Crystal how to cook so she could become a proper woman.
Barbara suddenly began shouting hysterically.
Wait, cooking?
This was the first I'd heard of Barbara teaching Crystal how to cook.
That's right. I was just teaching her to cook. But you know what? Crystal is utterly hopeless. She still touches knives like she's scared of them. I always make sure to instruct her strictly. It's your fault, Amy, for not teaching Crystal how to cook properly in the first place.
Hold on a second. Crystal is only 7 years old, you know? When it comes to cooking, I sometimes have her help with simple tasks, but I think it's too early to start teaching her seriously. Are you having Crystal handle knives at your place, Barbara? Surely you're using children's knives, right? Even in my confusion, I pressed Barbara for answers.
What kind of coddling nonsense are you spouting? Children's knives are like toys. I have her use regular adult knives. She's nowhere near mastering them, so I end up scolding her every time. It's a real hassle for me too. You're spoiling Crystal too much, Amy. That's why she's grown up to be such a weakling. Are you even fit to be a mother?
As Barbara berated me in a ranting manner, anger welled up inside me, and I opened my mouth to retort. But before I could utter a word, Fred yelled at Barbara.
Mom, what are you thinking? We never asked you to teach Crystal how to cook, not even once. And what's this about you scolding Crystal? What, Fred? You were there too? I thought it was just Amy. If Fred was there, you should have said so from the start.
Barbara seemed surprised, not having expected Fred to be by my side.
Is it a problem that I'm here? Could it be that the stress from you is what caused Crystal to collapse this time? Mom, explain yourself.
Fred's face was red with anger as he interrogated Barbara.
No, that's not stress. I mean, sure, I was a bit strict, but only a little. You see, I just wanted Crystal to grow up to be a fine woman. That's all I had in mind. So I haven't done anything wrong, right? Fred, please don't be so angry.
Barbara made excuses, but Fred coldly told her,
Enough. I can't trust your words, so I'll ask Crystal directly when she wakes up. Mom, don't think this will end here. Bye.
With that, he hung up the phone unilaterally. When the weekend arrived, Fred and I headed to a certain place. Crystal was staying at my parents' house, being looked after by them. Our destination was just a short walk away, so we arrived in 5 minutes.
I wonder if Barbara is home.
I said, Mom hates mornings.
It's only 9 a.m., so she's definitely there.
Fred replied. Yes, the place we arrived at was Barbara's house. When we rang the doorbell, Barbara appeared after a while, wearing pajamas.
What are you two doing here, showing up without any notice?
Barbara's eyes widened upon seeing us.
Mom, we're coming in,
Fred said as he stepped into the house, and I followed suit.
Hey, wait! What's the meaning of this, barging in all of a sudden?
Barbara was flustered, but I ignored her and chased after Fred. Our destination was the kitchen. It was my first time entering the kitchen at Barbara's house, and the sight that greeted me was far from tidy and organized. There was a pile of dirty dishes, and ladles and spatulas were scattered haphazardly. The only seasonings I could spot were salt and sugar. As I stood there in shock, Fred revealed a startling fact.
Mom has always been terrible at cooking. She has absolutely no self-awareness about it, though. What?
As I stood there at a loss for words.
Hey, don't just go into the kitchen without permission.
Barbara started shouting. Fred ignored Barbara and began to speak.
Mom is the type who doesn't trust recipes and cooks everything her own way. Basically, everything she makes is unappetizing. She thinks she can manage as long as she has salt, sugar, and butter. She claims to taste her cooking, but I guess she's just tone deaf when it comes to flavor. And yet, she's convinced that she's a great cook, which is terrifying. No matter how much Dad and I complained, she never listened to a word we said.
I had never eaten Barbara's cooking, so I had no idea. Whenever we had meals at Barbara's house, we usually opted for delivery or dining out. But thinking back, I feel like Fred always managed to steer the situation in a way that allowed him to avoid eating Barbara's home-cooked meals. Despite being terrible at cooking, Barbara had been forcibly teaching Crystal how to cook. I felt my anger rising even more.
Fred! Stop saying whatever you want!
Barbara yelled, but Fred continued to ignore her.
The kitchen is as filthy as ever,
Fred muttered bitterly as he opened the refrigerator. The fridge wasn't adequately stocked with ingredients, but there were a few new cucumbers prepared. On the day Crystal collapsed, after the phone call with Barbara, we spoke to Crystal as soon as she woke up. At first, Crystal was reluctant to talk, but Fred and I earnestly conveyed our feelings to her.
Mommy and Daddy love you no matter what, Crystal. We love you more than anything in the world.
I looked straight into Crystal's eyes and told her firmly. Really? Crystal's eyes wavered with uncertainty, but Fred also spoke to her gently. That's right. You're Daddy and Mommy's treasure, Crystal. Finally feeling reassured, Crystal began to talk little by little.
Grandma forced me to hold a knife and told me to practice cutting cucumbers quickly.
Apparently, Barbara had made Crystal hold an adult knife and relentlessly practice cutting a cucumber within 20 seconds. Crystal had only ever used a peeler before, so she was scared and didn't want to do it, but Barbara yelled at her and forced the knife into her hand.
She made you do that against your will.
When I asked in surprise, Crystal nodded.
Yeah, I was really scared of Grandma, so I had no choice but to do it.
Moreover, if Crystal made even the slightest mistake, Barbara would immediately scold her harshly. As a result, Crystal was cutting cucumbers under extreme tension every time. That's why her face was always red when she came back from Barbara's house. It seems that Barbara was also the reason why Crystal collapsed during her cooking class. The memory of being scolded by Barbara and the sensation of gripping the knife in class triggered a strong fear of failure, causing her to faint from anemia.
You know, I was always scared and hated cooking with Grandma, but I love cooking with Mommy. Because Mommy always praises me. And Daddy always tells me that the food Mommy and I make is delicious, which made me really happy.
Crystal, thank you for telling us. Can I ask why you couldn't talk to Mommy or Daddy about this until now? I gently inquired, as I had been wondering all along why Crystal hadn't told us about this before.
That's because Grandma said that girls who are bad at cooking will be hated by their moms. I thought if I told you about this, you would think I'm bad at cooking and end up hating me.
Upon hearing Crystal's words, I felt intense anger and hatred towards Barbara. It seemed Fred felt the same way. Fred and I reassured Crystal once again, gently telling her,
"That would never happen. Even if you were bad at cooking, we would still love you just the same, Crystal. There's absolutely no way Mommy and Daddy could ever hate you. Don't worry."
When we told her that, Crystal smiled as if relieved. And Crystal was able to return home that very day. After tucking Crystal into bed,
"I want to see Barbara's kitchen. I need to see for myself the place where Crystal was made to suffer,"
I told Fred.
"All right. Let's go this weekend."
Fred agreed. We quickly explained the situation to my parents, and they agreed to come over. Standing in front of the dilapidated kitchen, I felt so angry I could have collapsed, thinking about how Crystal had endured such hardship in this place. Fred spoke to Barbara in a harsh tone.
"Mom, you're in no position to teach Crystal how to cook when you're terrible at it yourself. What you did to Crystal is absolutely unforgivable. Forcing a 7-year-old child to use an adult knife. I seriously question your sanity." "What? I'm not bad at cooking. What's wrong with teaching my granddaughter how to cook? I just thought it would be good for her to get used to knives from an early age. If she had obediently listened to me from the start, I wouldn't have had to force her. Everything I did was for Crystal's sake. Why am I being blamed so much for this?"
Barbara showed no sign of remorse whatsoever, instead taking on a defiant attitude.
"Barbara, you repeatedly told Crystal that girls who can't cook will be scolded by their moms, trying to manipulate her emotionally, didn't you? Because of that, Crystal couldn't come to us for help and suffered in silence."
I also unleashed my anger at Barbara, but she just laughed mockingly.
"Oh please, if you had properly taught Crystal how to cook in the first place, none of this would have happened. Honestly, it's your fault that Crystal has grown up to be such a spoiled brat."
"Don't screw with us. We're cutting ties with you, Mom. We're moving away to get away from you. Your arm has long since healed, and from now on, we won't contact you at all, and we'll never see you again."
At Fred's words, Barbara's face instantly turned ashen, and she started to panic.
"Wait a minute. Cutting ties, that's too extreme. There's no need to get so angry over something like this. Don't say you're moving. Don't leave me alone. I'm your only mother, aren't I? Please, just stay by my side forever."
Barbara clung to Fred, but of course, he ignored her. Then she started cozying up to me.
"Hey, Amy. I'm sorry. I was wrong. I won't force anything on Crystal anymore. Please don't leave me alone."
"I will never forgive you for what you put Crystal through. You, who can so easily declare others unfit to be mothers,
must be a wonderful mom yourself, so I'm sure you'll be just fine on your own.
I told her with a smile and left Barbara's house together with Fred. As we stepped outside, we saw Crystal had come with my parents.
Crystal, you're here too?
I asked.
Yeah, I have something I want to say to Grandma.
Crystal replied. Just then, Barbara came out of the house, shouting.
Wait, you too!
When Barbara saw Crystal and my parents, she muttered with an awkward expression.
Crystal and Amy's parents too.
Crystal firmly told Barbara.
I have more fun cooking with Mommy, so I won't learn from you anymore, Grandma. I never want to see you again. I have more fun cooking with Mommy, so I won't learn from you anymore, Grandma. I never want to see you again.
Leaving a stunned Barbara behind, we all returned home together. After that, we quickly found a suitable place far away from Barbara's house and moved immediately. By coincidence, our new home was closer to my parents' place, so we started having meals with them once a month. I was worried that Crystal might start hating cooking because of Barbara, but whenever she cooked with me, Crystal always smiled happily. When I bought Crystal a cute children's knife with a cat pattern on it, she was overjoyed and started enthusiastically practicing cutting vegetables with it. Before long, she became skilled at using the knife.
Crystal, you're getting better and better at this. That's amazing. I praised her. I'm happy when you praise me, Mommy. I want to become even better at cutting,
Crystal said, flashing me a big smile. As for Barbara's recent situation, according to what Fred heard from his relatives, she's in a miserable state. Barbara had always eaten out frequently and was prone to obesity. After cutting ties with us, her eating habits worsened and her weight kept increasing. Eventually, it seems she injured her foot due to her weight. She tried calling us, but of course, we had her number blocked, so she couldn't get through. Apparently, she turned to her relatives for help. However, Barbara had never gotten along well with her relatives. They disliked her overconfidence in her poor cooking skills and her tendency to force her values on others, so they saw her as a nuisance. But they couldn't just ignore Barbara when she came to them with an injured foot, so they reluctantly provided her with a spare room to live in. However, it seems that for Barbara, every day is filled with stress. In exchange for providing her with a room, the relatives are supposedly pushing household chores onto Barbara despite her foot injury and complaining about how terrible her cooking is. And so, Barbara is apparently living through hell every single day. Fred and I vowed to be careful never to let Crystal suffer like that again. We're making an effort to spend even more time with Crystal, not just focusing on work. We want to build a family where we can discuss anything openly and continue supporting each other as a family of 3 in our daily lives.
Being broke and useless is grounds for divorce.
So said Matthew as he left the divorce papers on the table and walked out. I was left staring at those papers, dumbfounded, on my hospital bed. I had my suspicions for a while. But to think he was actually cheating. And he's leaving me because I'm useless and can't earn money while hospitalized and because Alyson's pregnant?
Mom?
Startled, I looked up to find my precious son Harlan and my dad standing there. My dad looked at what I was holding and frowned.
What are you going to do?
There's only one thing to do.
With some persuasion, I managed an early discharge and headed to the bank where Matthew works. My dad, who drove me there, cheered me on.
You can do it.
Then he dropped me off in front of the bank and drove away. As I entered the bank, Matthew, noticing me, frowned. Coincidentally, there were no other customers in front of Matthew. I approached him directly.
I'm closing all the company accounts. What?
Let's show him whose daughter he's angered. While Matthew turned pale, I couldn't help but smirk. I am Sabrina, a 32-year-old corporate executive and mother of 1. I have a 7-year-old son named Harlan and my husband's name is Matthew. Matthew and I met at a party thrown by mutual friends during our college days. Back then, we had no interest in each other and merely exchanged contact information. Hey, weren't you at that party? Sabrina, right? Oh, Matthew? The following year, by coincidence, I used the bank where he worked, and we reconnected. That led to us keeping in touch regularly and eventually started dating. After I got pregnant with Harlan, we got married. Matthew was known for his serious and meticulous work, which made my friends envy that I had him as my husband. I, too, was happy to have married him.
Mom, why does this become this?
Hold on a sec. I don't know that much myself, so I'll look into it.
Okay.
Harlan, perhaps inheriting traits from Matthew, is studious and curious. He's always asking questions, which keeps me on my toes with my own studies.
What's this? Why?
Surprisingly, Harlan's admiration is not for Matthew but for my dad. My mother passed away from illness, and my dad, despite his busy work life, raised me as a single parent.
I'm sorry, but it's hard to get along with your dad. Well, it can't be helped, but don't say that to him. He's quite sensitive about it. No way, I could.
My dad is a kind man but looks intimidating and somewhat scary. Matthew is also not comfortable around him due to his appearance. My dad, aware of this, has always tried not to interfere too much. Thus, our life was peaceful at the beginning, a life that seemed full of promise. But that changed drastically after we got married.
Hey! Where did you put my mobile phone?
Don't say it like I'm responsible for it.
Isn't it still on the charger? Right after waking up, Matthew would ask grumpily. Indeed, his mobile phone was where he left it charging the night before. No apologies or thanks from him, just a click of his tongue, which irritated me. Matthew changed after we got married. And whenever he had the chance, he would say this: "I'm an elite banker.
Thanks to me, you're living a comfortable life."
Yet Matthew doesn't contribute financially at home. He spends his entire salary on himself, yet acts as if he's supporting the household. In reality, I'm the one supporting our family. I pay for all the utilities and groceries.
Hey! What's with these new clothes?
They're for Harlan. He's outgrown his old ones.
Don't spend my money on luxuries. I'm paying with my own salary. I don't even have access to your account.
Yet, if I take Harlan out for a meal or buy new clothes, he immediately complains. He seems to dislike any form of luxury, no matter how small. On the other hand, my dad is the type of person who's willing to spend money for our sake.
The apartment you're in now is too small, right? That's why I bought the condo you and Matthew wanted to live in. And it's not far from my place, so I could be close with you guys,"
he said, laughing, and gave us the top floor as a gift. And to be there for us in times of need, he lives on a different floor in the same building.
Mom, can I go to Grandpa's? Of course, but just because it's the same building doesn't mean you can stay out late. Make sure you come back before it gets dark.
Okay.
It might be natural for Harlan to be closer to his grandfather than his father, Matthew. Whenever he has the chance, Harlan goes to see my dad.
Where's Harlan?
At Dad's place. Is that so? Matthew never complains about my dad to him directly. And it seems he's careful not to say too much around Harlan, fearing he might tell my dad. It's just me he's bold with. Certainly, I keep quiet not to trouble my dad. Well, if it's just complaints, I can ignore them. That's how lightly I thought of it as. And so unlike my dad, Matthew doesn't participate in childcare at all.
I've been called out by Alyson, so I'm heading out.
What? Again? And it's Matthew's childhood friend Alyson who's stealing away his time from childcare. I dislike her, more than just being uncomfortable around her. Matthew and I are like siblings. So please don't misunderstand. Every time she meets me, she would say something like that. Yet, she always tries to assert her dominance. Matthew used to be. As if she knows Matthew better than I do, which is just annoying. Valeria, Matthew's mother-in-law, also dotes on Alyson, which complicates things further.
Why did Matthew choose such a woman instead of Alyssum? He should have married Alyssum.
When called to my in-laws, Valeria made sure to say such things loud enough for me to hear. John, my father-in-law, always scolds her for it, but she doesn't seem to care. Alyssum claims to be a natural airhead.
I'm just a natural airhead, that's why I rely on Matthew so much. I don't mean to make Sabrina uncomfortable.
This might be okay if she were younger. But she's 28, not exactly young. It's time she acted her age. The reason she and Matthew didn't end up together is because of John.
I don't want such a woman even as an in-law. If it really comes down to it, I'll divorce you.
Alyssum can hardly be called as a good person. She's notorious for playing around with men and doesn't work either. Whatever she wants, she gets Matthew to buy for her. John despises Alyssum and strongly opposed their relationship. I could never understand why Valeria adores Alyssum so much.
I'm sorry for my wife's behavior. It's not something you should apologize for, John. Matthew too. To not defend his wife from such remarks, and instead, being friendly with such a woman.
True to John's words, no matter what Valeria says about me, Matthew never defends me. Sometimes, he even laughs.
Why do you say those things, Grandma? If Mom and Dad hadn't met, I wouldn't be born. Does that mean I'm an unwanted child to you, Grandma?
No, that's not true at all.
Harlan always stands up for me in place of Matthew. Harlan may not understand how children are made, but he knows they can't be born without both parents. Valeria adores her brilliant grandson, so she refrains from making such remarks in front of Harlan. In that aspect, Valeria and Matthew are very alike, making it seem they really are related.
I have plans to drink with Alyssum tonight, so I'll be home late. Oh, really?
Gradually, I started to wonder if Matthew was necessary for us at all. And I began preparing for divorce. Harlan seemed to sense something too.
If there's anything I can help with, just let me know,
he said, showing concern for me. Then, I was summoned by Valeria. I really didn't want to go, but she kept calling persistently enough that it would affect my work if I didn't show up.
John is away on business, so there's no one to carry heavy things. Can you buy some rice?
Apparently, John was on a business trip. I wanted to tell her to just order it online, but saying that would clearly lead to an argument. After being tasked with carrying heavy items after work, I was exhausted. As I was heading back to the condo in a daze, my body was thrown by a car. It seems a car that ran a red light hit me.
The driver who hit you fled the scene, and we're currently investigating,
I was informed while lying in a hospital bed. For now, I left Harlan in my father's care and decided to stay in the hospital for a while. I broke my arm, so I couldn't work properly in this state. When I was being worried about such things, my dad scolded me.
First, worry about your own health.
Harlan, my father, and John, who came back in a hurry after hearing about the accident, visited me frequently, but Matthew and Valeria did not visit me at all. Well, that was within my expectations.
Coming in.
What?
So, I was surprised when Matthew showed up in my hospital room. Sign this. Matthew presented me with divorce papers. Already signed by him, with Valeria's name as a witness.
With that arm, you won't be able to work. Now that you can't make money, you're useless to me. What is that supposed to mean? And besides, Alyssum is pregnant with my child.
My thoughts froze at those words. Alyssum is pregnant with Matthew's child.
I'm going to marry Alyssum. So just sign this quickly.
Saying that, Matthew turned his back on me. As if I was of no further use to him.
Being broke and useless is grounds for divorce,
Matthew said as he left the divorce papers on the table and walked out. I was left staring at those papers, dumbfounded, on my hospital bed. I had my suspicions for a while. But, to think he was actually cheating. And he's leaving me because I'm useless and can't earn money while hospitalized and because Alyssum's pregnant?
Mom?
Startled, I looked up to find my precious son Harlan and my dad standing there. My dad looked at what I was holding and frowned.
What are you going to do?
There's only one thing to do,
I answered while looking straight at my dad. My dad nodded in agreement. Well then, let's fight back. With some persuasion, I managed an early discharge and headed to the bank where Matthew works. My dad, who drove me there, cheered me on.
You can do it.
Then he dropped me off in front of the bank and drove away. As I entered the bank, Matthew, noticing me, frowned. Coincidentally, there were no other customers in front of Matthew. I approached him directly.
I'm closing all the company accounts. What?
Matthew's expression clearly said, "What are you talking about?" Without taking a number, I stood directly at the counter, noticing a few annoyed glances from others.
Oh, excuse me. Maybe you didn't understand without the company name.
What are you?
I'm Sabrina Gibney. I recently took over my father and became the CEO. The company is Gibney Corporation.
What the?
Gibney Corporation is an IT company my father founded, now employing 1,900 staffs, and is quite well known in this area and within the industry due to its rapid growth in one generation. That's why Matthew was so surprised.
That's a lie, right? You're just trying to get back at me. If you think so, why don't you check?
Matthew started checking something immediately at my words. While he was busy, I looked around. Having mentioned the company name, the surrounding people were now paying attention to us.
Oh my God, what? No way.
It seemed he had confirmed it. Matthew looked up at me hesitantly.
You're really from that Gibney Corporation?
Let's show him whose daughter he has angered. Contrary to Matthew's pale face, I smirked unpleasantly.
That's right, so please proceed with the cancellation quickly.
Wait, if you cancel all at once like this. By the way, my father is quite angry about this matter as well. Quickly pack your things and leave the apartment. What? Why should I be the one to leave?
It seems Matthew had forgotten that the apartment was purchased by my father, and the ownership was in my father's name. Otherwise, he wouldn't have brought a listen-in while I was hospitalized and still be living there.
Forgot? That apartment was bought by my father, the former president. You haven't contributed any money, let alone for living expenses. You've been spending everything on your childhood friend and mistress, Alyson. In fact, you've been living on my salary. Who do you think has been supporting your lifestyle? Well, about that. And now, because she's pregnant, you expect me to hand over the apartment to you and your mistress? How much more do you intend to insult me?
I made sure to speak loudly enough for those around to hear. And of course, Matthew was flustered. After all, he's known for being serious. That he, of all people, wouldn't contribute financially at home and was cheating with a childhood friend. The looks we received from those around us turned cold.
Is that true? What?
The one who approached me was Ogden, the branch manager of this bank. He had been here for a while, listening to our conversation.
I believe we need to have a detailed discussion. I am very sorry for the inconvenience caused by our bank employee.
And with that, Ogden offered a deep apology. Following this, I was taken to the back to discuss further with Matthew, Ogden, and myself. There, I explained the situation to Ogden in detail.
I am terribly sorry for the trouble our employee has caused.
Ogden sighed deeply and apologized again. Next to him, Matthew sat looking displeased, and to that, Ogden forcibly grabbed his head to make him apologize.
I understand your feelings, Sabrina. It's natural not to want to entrust your money to a bank that employs such people. If you're considering closing your account, we can arrange that. I am no longer his wife. If you accept one condition, I might reconsider closing the account.
The two of them looked up hopefully at my words. It was a good deal for Ogden, but the worst possible condition for Matthew.
If you fire Matthew here, I would like to continue my contract with this bank.
What?
Of course. We were actually planning to let him go.
It seemed Ogden had already intended to do so. Matthew, initially confused, gradually turned red in the face. As he was about to say something.
"Excuse me, but Sabrina's father has arrived."
Another bank employee approached us. I had asked Ogden to let him in, thwarting Matthew, who, frustrated, closed his mouth.
"Why do I have to be here? What? Mom?"
"Sorry for making you wait." Dad entered, firmly holding Valeria's arm. Valeria, looking displeased, glared at me upon seeing me.
"This is your doing. What are you trying to accomplish? I'll never forgive you for treating your mother-in-law like this." "Quiet."
As Valeria began to shout, my dad fiercely scolded her. Giving an even more intimidating look, he managed to silence them.
"I know you've been harassing my daughter. Calling her for trivial tasks, making her carry heavy things. Despite this, instead of showing gratitude, you prefer to listen, and you made sure my daughter heard it." And Matthew, far from defending, laughed, and even Harlan had to step in to protect her.
My dad's angry voice echoed through the bank. Matthew tried to intervene but remained silent under my dad's stern gaze.
"And I'm aware that Alyson is the one who hit Sabrina. That woman has already been arrested by the police. Could Alyson really have done such a thing? Why are you surprised? You're the mastermind."
My dad scolded at her even more. Meanwhile, Matthew, seemingly unaware, froze in shock.
"What? You both are the worst. Sabrina, let's go." "Yes."
Prompted by my dad, we headed outside. Ogden followed, apologizing repeatedly. Thinking I might continue the contract with Ogden in charge, we heard Matthew and Valeria arguing loudly behind us. It seemed they were blaming each other. Their voices could be heard outside, and the customers and bank employees who were present whispered that what they had heard was true.
"Just as planned." "Yes." They reacted just as we expected, which helped.
Our plan had gone smoothly, and we left the bank laughing confidently. As a result, Matthew was indeed fired. Thanks to the police conducting a thorough investigation, Alyson received a prison sentence. As for Valeria, she was forced to divorce John after it was discovered she had instigated Alyson to run me over in an attempt to get rid of me. Valeria was also taken into custody by the police.
"Welcome back, Mom, Grandpa. I'm home."
"Thank you for looking after Harlan, John." "No problem. Seems like you've settled everything at the bank." After cornering Matthew and his accomplices at the bank, I went to pick up Harlan, whom I had left with John. John had helped a lot this time too. He found evidence that Valeria was instigating Alyson and discovered notes about their plan to eliminate me, which he handed over to the police. When I thanked him for everything, John said with a smile,
"You did great."
Since then, my days have become busier than ever. Being busy as a next-in-line president and a board member already, becoming president has added even more responsibility on me due to Matthew. And as for my dad, he started a new company.
"I've always wanted to start a new company,"
he said, pushing the presidency onto me, eager to show Matthew up. Because of that, both my father and I became busy, so John has been looking after Harlan. Apparently, John's business trip was forced upon him because Valeria was having an affair with his boss. He took early retirement and moved into a vacant apartment in our building.
"I'm currently studying about remote work."
Planning to eventually entrust him with work, I've sent someone knowledgeable his way. He seems very capable, so I'd like him to excel in my new company. It seems my dad and John got along very well after this incident, often visiting each other's apartments to drink and chat. On the other hand, Matthew, having been driven out, returned to his empty family home. Unable to find employment at any bank with rumors spread by my dad and I everywhere, he was left unemployable, forced to pay me compensation through debts. Now, spending his days tirelessly working part-time jobs, he came crying to us, but we collectively ignored him. Once rumored to be on the fast track to becoming a branch manager, he has fallen far.
"When I grow up, I want to be like Grandpa."
Harlan has come to respect my dad even more after this incident. Seeing him as a hero for rescuing us from the malicious acts of Matthew and Valeria. Would you take over for Grandpa someday?
Yes.
Hearing Harlan's willingness to follow in his footsteps, my dad was overjoyed. Determined not to be outdone by my father, I resolved to work even harder. Eventually, both my company and my father's company settled down.
Oh, welcome home, Mom.
Welcome back, looks like you worked hard. When I come home exhausted, I find John had already prepared dinner for us.
I helped today too. Really? That's great, Harlan. I'm looking forward to dinner.
Praising Harlan's effort with a smile, my dad also returned home late. Then, the four of us sat around the dining table, chatting and eating dinner together. In stark contrast to us, Matthew and his accomplices were scattered. Matthew piled up debts upon debts, eventually becoming indebted to a loan shark. And I heard rumors he was put on a ship. Matthew's family home was sold to pay off his debts, and Valeria, now without a place to go, was spotted living under a bridge by an acquaintance.
By the way, I received an apology letter from Alyssan's parents. They're good people, I hope you'll read it. If you say so, John.
According to the letter from Alyssan's parents, she gave birth in prison. They took the child in, and after Alyssan's release, they moved away to ensure she wouldn't rely on them. The letter contained deep apologies to me. Alyssan's parents seem like very good people. I sincerely hope the child grows up to resemble their grandparents rather than their parents. Nonetheless, Alyssan too has lost a place to return to. I hope she reflects on her sins in her solitude. Time passed by and it had been 10 years since the divorce. We've grown without being troubled by Matthew.
Did I even have a dad?
Apparently, he vaguely remembers Matthew's existence but considers irrelevant to his life. And I too have completely forgotten about his existence.
I've decided to take over Grandpa's company after all.
If that's what you've decided, I won't object. Harlan chose to inherit my dad's company, which was originally a company making toys. Starting as an ordinary employee, Harlan is valued for his constant flow of ideas.
Maybe it's time to leave the company in Harlan's hands.
My dad would say so in a laugh. Once he hands over the company to Harlan, he plans to live a quiet life in the countryside. I'm also finding a successor and teaching them my job earnestly. Once they've grown enough, I too might consider early retirement and start a new path. With that thought of future in mind, I will continue to work as the CEO.
Really? Being late because you were helping a pregnant woman on the side of the road is such a cliché excuse. Are you kidding me?
On the day of my son's wedding, I made a terrible mistake. In my desperation to get a pregnant woman in labor into my car and to the hospital, I completely forgot about my son's wedding. Stella, who was supposed to become my son's wife, was furious, breathing heavily in a way I'd never seen before, her facial muscles trembling with anger. This was entirely my fault. I need to apologize sincerely. Relatives are walking towards the reception venue. The sound of stones hitting the ground echoes in my ears. Stella looks at my dress, pointing at various spots with a puzzled expression. It's because when I helped the pregnant woman, her water broke and stained my dress.
Unbelievable. How can you show up looking so dirty? And the smell. Are you happy ruining my wedding?
I'm so sorry, Stella. I'll get changed right away and try to make it to the reception in time.
I don't care if it's true or not, but putting others first like this is unacceptable. You're a failure as a parent. Please leave immediately without showing your face to Joseph.
Stella, in her dress, removed a hair ornament she was wearing and threw it at me. The hair ornament must have been light and landed at my feet.
If it were me, I'd come here no matter if someone had collapsed in the middle of the road or if there was a car accident. Today is that important of a day.
Her anger didn't subside, and she grabbed stones from the ground and threw them at my face with all her might.
Ouch, Stella, stop.
I shield my face and get into my car. After hitting the car's windshield hard.
Go home.
Stella yelled. I gripped the steering wheel. It seems I won't be able to attend my son's wedding, and my relationship with Stella is completely broken. But, if my son Joseph can be happy, then this is for the best. It's all my fault today. I should just go home. Just as I was thinking this, there was a small knock on the passenger side window. It was a very unexpected person. My name is Scarlett. I lost my husband in a traffic accident when I was young and raised my son Joseph on my own. After graduating from college, Joseph got a job at a major electronics manufacturer. Finally, standing on his own 2 feet, he is now dating a woman he met at a party. The fact that my son became independent made me let my guard down, and the pain in my body I had been ignoring until now has started to stand out recently. I quit my job as a nurse, which I had been doing for a long time, and am unemployed now. I'm living modestly, dipping into my savings. It's regrettable that I have to rely somewhat on Joseph's income. In my mind, my son is still the boy who would call out, "Mom," and happily bring me snacks from the candy corner. My cute son of those times and the Joseph now with his stubble are the same person, right? I think to myself. Joseph, after work at night, always wears the same gray sweatpants and drinks while watching TV. But on weekends, he takes a shower in the morning, shaves his beard meticulously, and takes care of his eyebrows. He spends over 30 minutes in front of the mirror, then goes straight back to his room. After changing into a neat appearance, he comes out satisfied, takes out coffee from the fridge, and pours it into a cup. Going out today? A date? It's not really a date. I'm thinking of taking a walk along the river with her. After drinking the coffee heartily enough that I can hear it going down his throat, he brushes his teeth and then hurries off to meet his girlfriend. I take the newspaper out of the mailbox, pull out today's flyers, and put on my glasses. Now, which supermarket has the best deals today? Ever since I got married, it has been my daily routine to check the flyers like this every morning. Meat from this supermarket, vegetables from that one. After marking some flyers with a red pen, I suddenly tilt my head. Dressing up just for a walk. Does she really enjoy that? Joseph never wastes money unnecessarily, perhaps because I always nag him about saving money. As a child, he showed no interest in toys or video games, instead drawing on the back of newspaper flyers every day. Even his pencils and paints were hand-me-downs from a neighbor. Yet, Joseph never complained and seemed happy drawing every day. That day, I was cleaning from the morning, and by mid-afternoon, the doorbell rang. Who could it be? I wondered, opening the door to find Joseph standing there. What is it? Why did you ring the doorbell? Mom. There's someone I want you to meet. With a slightly embarrassed expression, Joseph introduced a young woman wearing a white dress standing behind him. Her slender, delicate arms suited the white dress perfectly. Despite it being the middle of winter, the woman, dressed in just a thin dress and a lace shawl, looked as beautiful as a fairy. Hello. My name is Stella. I'm dating Joseph. It's nice to meet you. The woman who introduced herself as Stella greeted me with a clear voice and a lovely smile. Joseph then said to Stella, "Please, come in," and led her to the living room. As I was looking for some snacks to serve them, Joseph came into the kitchen, so I playfully tapped his head. If you were going to bring someone, you should have told me. I'm completely unprepared when you just show up like this. Eh? Oh, sorry. Stella didn't want to tell you about coming over because she wanted to see our home as it is. As it is, huh? I'm relieved I cleaned up in the morning. As we talked a bit, Joseph, with a serious look, told me he was considering marrying Stella. Joseph is over 30 now, and I had been bracing myself for a day like this to come. Still, the thought that the days of just mom and son might be coming to an end. It makes my heart ache a bit. Suddenly, Joseph's mobile phone rang, and he excused himself saying, "Sorry. It's a call from work." and left the room. Left alone with Stella, we chatted about trivial things until Stella pointed at a painting of the sea on the wall drawn by Joseph.
Is that one drawn by Joseph?
Yes, it is.
It's a bit see-through on the back because it's drawn on the back of a flyer, but it's a nice painting, isn't it?
Stella stood up to take a closer look at the painting Joseph had made. A blue sea and a blue sky. Nothing else, just an expanse of sea painted entirely with blue paint. The blue sea spread out with just blue, and in the blue sky, 2 small clouds floated. Joseph and I went to the beach for a swim just once when he was a child. I explained to Stella that this was a painting of the sea from that time. After silently staring at the painting for a while, Stella sat down quietly in front of me and said,
"This painting is very sad."
"Eh? Really?"
"Oh, I always thought it was a happy painting of us playing at the beach." "Is that so? Normally, if you go to the beach, wouldn't you draw yourself swimming?"
Stella said this to me as if making a clear statement. In this painting of the sea, there is only the blue sky and the blue sea. She declared that surely there were no happy memories of the beach, just a record of the first time seeing the sea captured in the painting.
And on a flyer, no less.
She criticized me for not even providing proper drawing paper, despite his talent for painting.
"Joseph is a wonderful person. You should have given him a richer life. He has talent in his painting, and you are surely the one who crushed it." "That's not. Joseph never said he wanted to study painting seriously. I thought it was just a hobby. Surely he understood from a young age that the household was poor. Being raised in a single-parent home must have been hard for Joseph."
Stella took out a clean white handkerchief from her bag and pressed it against her slightly moist eyes. Until Joseph returned from his call, Stella explained how Joseph has always been frugal. Listening to her, I was filled with remorse from the bottom of my heart. I was a saver, and I had instilled that in Joseph. Having been like this since childhood, perhaps Joseph, even as an adult, naturally practices it and is called a saver by everyone. Maybe Joseph had been complaining to Stella about not being able to afford luxuries as a child. Perhaps I was indeed a terrible mom, as Stella said. Joseph came back after finishing his call. Stella, as if forgetting all our previous conversation, asked if there was an old album of Joseph's childhood or something. While looking through the nostalgic old albums, Joseph and Stella talked happily about what photos to use for their wedding. Stella seems not to have a job and lives at her parents' house, helping with household chores. Thrifty Joseph and Stella, who lives with her parents, seem to make an effort not to spend money, often walking in the neighborhood park. Looking at photos of Joseph when he was young in the album. "We walked here the other day," she says with a gentle smile, truly angelic. A whole year was about to pass since our first meeting. Joseph and Stella continued to date smoothly, and from what I've heard, they got along well without any major arguments. Sometimes when they came to visit, Stella would look at the painting of the sea on the wall and murmur sadly, "Poor thing." So one day, I took it down from the wall and hid it in a corner of a shelf. I wanted to avoid anything that might worsen Stella's impression of me. Later, I had the chance to meet Stella's parents. Stella's parents seemed kind and gentle, impressed by how I had raised my son alone after losing my husband at a young age. Stella, not seeming amused, listened in silence. Even now, with the wedding imminent, a heavy atmosphere lingered between me and her. Then came the wedding day. The weather forecast promised clear skies all day. Blessed with fantastic weather, it was warm and pleasant despite being midwinter, with no wind. I managed to dress myself in a gown borrowed from a relative and wore sneakers to drive to the venue. I left home with more than an hour to spare. On the way, I stopped at a grocery store to buy a drink and noticed a woman crouched in a corner of the parking lot. I thought she was just sitting, but I could faintly hear moaning, so I approached. "Are you okay?" The woman sitting didn't respond to my voice. Instead, she was breathing heavily, desperately gripping the hem of her dress. I realized she was pregnant, and that she had just gone into labor. I was a nurse once, so I've seen this situation many times. In as calm a voice as I could muster, I smiled and said, "Can you get into my car? I'll take you to the hospital." The pregnant woman looked surprised, but then told me her regular doctor was at the city hospital. After laying her in the back seat, it seemed her water had broken, as amniotic fluid dripped down her thighs. I rushed back into the grocery store to buy a towel and wrapped it around her waist. After calling the hospital to inform them of her condition, I started driving. Lying down, she was contacting what seemed to be her husband on her mobile phone. I considered calling an ambulance, but decided driving her myself would be faster since the roads were clear. "It's okay, calm down. We'll be at the hospital soon. Just breathe deeply and try to relax. Let me know if you're cold, I can lend you my jacket or anything." In the car, I kept encouraging the pregnant woman. Upon reaching the hospital, I quickly handed her over to the medical staff waiting in the parking lot, and I felt a wave of exhaustion as the tension left me. After explaining the situation to the nurses, I was sitting in the waiting room resting and drinking juice when two men approached me. They were the husband and father of the woman I had just helped. Both in suits, they must have been at work. They bowed repeatedly. "Thank you so much." Thanking me. I mentioned I used to be a nurse. "She will definitely give birth safely." And smiled. Then I noticed something. The father, an elderly man, was dressed in formal attire. Seeing him, I snapped back to reality and remembered. Right, I must hurry to the venue or I'll be terribly late. Cutting short their words of thanks, I said, "Sorry, I have to be somewhere," and quickly returned to my car to rush to the venue. Despite my haste, I arrived significantly late. The group photos were already done, and they were about to move to the reception. Then, I saw Stella in her wedding dress. Her face, peeking out from the pure white dress, was even more beautiful than usual, taking my breath away. Escorted by the staff, she walked step by step, like a lily flower in bloom. But the next moment, Stella's eyes met mine exactly. Then, ignoring the staff, she ran towards me with a face filled with anger. "I'm sorry, you see. On my way here, I came across a pregnant woman who had just started labor."
What? Helping a pregnant woman on the side of the road is such a cliché excuse. Are you kidding me?
I desperately tried to think of an excuse to prove it wasn't a lie, but couldn't come up with anything. I explained that I was so focused on getting the pregnant woman into my car and to the hospital that I completely forgot about the ceremony. Stella was angry, breathing heavily in a way I've never seen before, her facial muscles trembling. It was as if she was about to physically attack me, and I apologized earnestly. This was entirely my fault. I sincerely needed to apologize. Thinking about how Joseph would have been looked down upon by the attendees for having his parents' seat empty hurt me. Stella pointed at various spots on the dress I was wearing, her face forming a puzzled expression. It was because the fluid had stained my dress when I was assisting the woman whose water had broken.
Unbelievable. How can you show up in such a dirty state? And the smell. This is too much. Are you happy ruining my wedding?
"I'm so sorry, Stella. I'll get changed right away and try to make it at least to the reception in time."
I don't know if it's true or not, but putting others first like this is unacceptable. You're a failure as a parent. Please leave immediately without seeing Joseph.
Stella slowly removed a hair ornament she was wearing and threw it at me. The hair ornament must have been light and landed at my feet. Her anger didn't seem to subside, as she grabbed stones from the ground and threw them at my face with all her might.
Ouch, Stella, stop. If it were me, no matter if someone had collapsed on the road or there was a traffic accident, I would come here. Today is that important of a day.
Despite Stella's words, calling an ambulance would have been slower than me driving her. Yet, I didn't have time to make such excuses as Stella kept throwing stones at me. I shielded my face and got into my car. After Stella hit the car's windshield hard, she yelled,
"Go home."
I gripped the steering wheel. it seemed I wouldn't be able to attend my son's wedding, and my relationship with Stella was completely broken. But if it meant Joseph could be happy, then it was worth it. It was all my fault today. I was thinking of just going home. Just then, there was a small knock on the passenger side window. I stiffened and looked in that direction. The father of the pregnant woman I had taken to the hospital was looking at me with a refreshing smile.
Huh? I just saw you at.
As I opened the window halfway, the elderly man smiled even more warmly at me. I'm sorry I couldn't thank you properly before. My name is Anderson. I got out of the car, glancing at Stella still furious nearby, and bowed slightly before Mr. Anderson. The man who introduced himself as Anderson handed me a business card from a neat jacket. It bore the name of the company where Joseph worked, and seeing his title, I involuntarily covered my mouth. CEO. Are you the president of the company where Joseph works? Anderson smiled broadly and nodded. I had heard that Joseph's boss was coming, but I never imagined it would be the president himself. I admired Joseph's boldness for inviting him, but this wasn't the time for that.
I'm embarrassed you had to see such a scene.
As I apologized to Mr. Anderson, he shook his head and looked towards Stella.
I was on my way to the ceremony when I got a call that my pregnant daughter had gone into labor and was taken to the hospital.
I'm sorry for being late, Ms. Bride.
No. If there was such a situation, being late is understandable. Is that so? I'm sorry, but your voice was a bit loud and it reached me. She is a savior to my daughter. I truly regret that her kindness caused you inconvenience.
But Mr. Anderson continued that he was more angry than sorry. Mr. Anderson said with a stern expression and tone that I had helped his daughter, who couldn't even call for help because she was in labor. That even the hospital was impressed with how quickly I acted, saying that calling an ambulance wouldn't have been fast enough and could have been dangerous. And that he couldn't forgive anyone who would insult a person who had saved someone dear to him. Stella's face turned pale, and she was speechless. Soon, perhaps worried that the bride had not arrived yet, Joseph hurried over. Upon noticing Mr. Anderson, he immediately bowed deeply. Before I could explain the situation, Mr. Anderson, with a smile, stopped me and explained everything to Joseph. His account was much more exaggerated and kinder than anything I could have said. He described how a brave and wonderful woman had helped a pregnant woman, leading to her late arrival at the important ceremony, and how Stella, failing to understand, had thrown stones at me. Indeed, as befits the president of a large company, his explanation was very skillful. Joseph, who had been listening intently, was visibly shocked. Sensing the tense atmosphere, Stella's parents approached with concerned looks on their faces. Worried this might turn into a condemnation of Stella and ruin the wedding. I apologized to Mr. Anderson and to Stella as well.
I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. It's all my fault for not coming to the venue right away.
Yes, that's right. Normally, wouldn't you change at the venue? Why did you come from home already dressed?
Because I was told that using the dressing room at the venue would cost extra.
I involuntarily shrank. Indeed, she was right. I could have sent the dress to the venue and changed there, using a dressing room. But I hesitated because of the extra costs for sending the dress and using the changing room. I had heard that the wedding expenses were carefully saved up by Joseph and Stella themselves. I didn't want to inflate the costs just because of me. Thinking so turned out to be a mistake.
Poor Joseph, having to live with such a poor mom. How sad for him. How much more do you plan to make him suffer?
My vision went white, and I placed a hand on my forehead and looked up at the sky. What a blue sky. What a perfect wedding it could have been, had I not been late. As I nearly collapsed, a large hand supported me from behind. Joseph firmly gripped my shoulder, staring at Stella. His eyes were not those of the kind son I knew, but rather cold.
Mom was very good at saving money, making sacrifices so that I could attend university without needing student loans.
I'm very grateful.
Joseph. It's true we were poor, but Mom always put me first,
raising me with lots of love. You have no right to say she made me suffer. I had always regretted making Joseph live a modest life since meeting Stella. Not being able to buy him the games he wanted, nor taking him to amusement parks. I thought maybe he resented having a forced saving mentality due to our poverty, not being able to say I want this, or I want to go somewhere. That's how I thought about Joseph. I'm sorry, Stella. But after you've insulted Mom like this, I can't imagine a life with you anymore. Let's call off the engagement.
What? Don't be ridiculous. Don't be such a mama's boy.
Stella's expression snapped with Joseph's unexpected declaration of calling off the engagement. Once as beautiful as a white fairy, her skin turned bright red, and mascara ran down from her tears, looking witch-like. As she cried and screamed like a demon, no one knew how to react, watching from a distance. Joseph spoke to her quietly, though his words likely didn't reach her ears. Still, he spoke in a calm, gentle voice. Disregarding savings and mocking poverty is prejudice. Saving is necessary for the future. Instead of ridiculing it, I wished we could respect each other and acknowledge diversity. I looked at Joseph's profile, which looked lonely. I thought he must still love her. Thus, the wedding was cancelled. When Stella's parents found out about the situation, they felt responsible and offered to cover all the expenses for the venue. However, Joseph, in his honesty, insisted that he also bore some responsibility and offered to share the costs. Stella's parents were deeply surprised by this. They apologized to me again, saying how sorry they were for what had happened to such a wonderful son. As a result, Stella was disowned by her parents and kicked out of her home. It seems Stella has become completely isolated, with the wedding incident spreading among friends. Now she's reportedly dabbling in unsavory clubs, using her beauty to her advantage. Meanwhile, Mr. Anderson's daughter gave birth safely, and both mother and child are healthy. Hearing this news through Joseph filled me with joy. On a sunny Sunday, as I started cleaning the room, I found the painting of the blue sky and sea tucked away in a corner. It was the painting by Joseph that Stella had called pitiful. Pausing my cleaning, I stared at it for a while until Joseph, just woken up and in his usual worn-out clothes, came out to get coffee from the fridge. What are you looking at? This painting you made when you were little. It used to hang on the wall, remember? Ah, that one. Joseph took a sip of his coffee, his expression unnaturally stiff. Stella said it's pitiful that this painting is on the back of a flyer, implying you were poor. At my words, Joseph snorted with laughter. It's not like I didn't have paper to draw on. And I didn't draw on the back of flyers because we were saving money or anything. What? Really? Yeah. You always looked so closely at the sale flyers, right? I figured if I drew on the back of that day's flyer, you'd definitely see my painting. I was so surprised that I gaped at him. Then, suddenly filled with amusement, I burst out laughing. Joseph, caught by my laughter, joined in, and our home was enveloped in joy. Next time, I'll find a woman who appreciates you too. Saving is also good for the environment, after all. Surely you'll find someone wonderful. I conveyed this sentiment in my heart. I'll continue to support Joseph from the shadows.